Preface of The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury by Julia Cartwright. Preface. This account of the way trodden by the pilgrims of the Middle Ages through the south of England to the shrine of St. Thomas of Canterbury originally appeared in the Art Journal for 1892, with illustrations by Mr. A. Quinton. It was published in the following year as a separate volume, and reprinted in 1895 and 1901. Now, by the courtesy of Messrs. Virtue's representatives, and in response to a continued demand, it appears again in a new and revised form, with the additional attraction of illustrations from original drawings by Mr. Hallam Murray. During the 20 years which have elapsed since these pages were first written, a whole literature has grown up around the Pilgrims Way. Not only have scholarly papers on separate sections of the road appeared in the journals of archaeological societies, but several valuable works on the subject have been issued by writers of authority. Mr. H. Snowden Ward has written a book on the Canterbury pilgrimages in Messrs. A and C Black's Pilgrimage series, in which he deals at length with the life and death, the cult and miracles of St. Thomas, and the different routes taken by pilgrims to his shrine. Mr. Palmer has described a considerable portion of the way in his treatise on 3 Surrey churches, and only last autumn Mr. Elliston Erwood published an excellent little guidebook called The Pilgrim's Road for the use of cyclists and pedestrians in Messrs. Warne's Homeland Pocketbook series. But the most thorough and systematic attempt to reconstruct the route taken by pilgrims from Winchester to Canterbury has been made by Mr. Belloc in his admirable work, The Old Road. The author himself walked along the ancient track and succeeded in filling up many gaps where the road had been lost, and in recovering almost the whole of the way, yard by yard, from the capital of Hampshire to the capital of Kent. This intimate knowledge of the road and its characteristics have led him to make several alterations in the line of the way marked on the ordnance map, which had hitherto served as the basis of most descriptions. But as Mr. Belloc himself recognises, it is clear that pilgrims often left the original road to visit churches and shrines in the neighbourhood. Thus, in several places, new tracks sprang up along the downs to which local tradition has given the name of the Pilgrims Way, and which it is not always easy to distinguish from the main road. Like Bunyan's pilgrims, when they came to the foot of the hill Difficulty, one turned to the left hand and the other to the right, but the narrow way lay right up the hill. In this edition of my book, some obvious errors have been corrected, and certain doubtful points have been cleared up with the help of experience gained by other workers in the same field. But as a rule, my object has been not so much to draw attention to the actual road, as to describe the antiquities and objects of interest which arrest the traveller's notice on his journey. From whatever side we approach it, the subject is a fascinating one. All of these different studies, varied in aims and scope as they may be, bear witness to the perennial interest which the Pilgrims' Way inspires. The beauty of the country through which the old road runs, its historic associations and famous memories, the ancient churches and houses which lie on its course, will always attract those who love and reverence the past, and will lead many to follow in the footsteps of the medieval pilgrims along the way to Canterbury. Julia Cartwright, Ockham, November the 1st, 1911. End of the preface.
Chapter 1 of The Pilgrims' Way from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Owlivia. The Pilgrims' Way from Winchester to Canterbury by Julia Cartwright. Chapter 1. The Pilgrims' Way. 370 years have passed since the shrine of St. Thomas at Canterbury was swept away and the martyr's ashes were scattered to the winds. The age of pilgrimages has gone by, the conditions of life have changed, and the influences which drew such vast multitudes of men and women to worship at the murdered archbishop's tomb have long ago ceased to work on the popular mind. No longer does the merry cavalcade of Chaucer's lay ride forth in the freshness of the spring morning, knight and merchant, scholar and lawyer, prioress and wife of Bath, yeoman and priest and friars, a motley company from all parts of the realm, ready to wenden on their pilgrimage with full devout courage to Canterbury. The days of pilgrimages are over, their fashion has passed away. But still some part of the route which the travellers took can be traced, and the road they trod still bears the name of the Pilgrims' Way. Over the Surrey hills and through her stately parks, the dark yews which lined the path may yet be seen. By many a quiet Kentish homestead, the grassy track still winds its way along the lonely hillside overlooking the blue weald, and if you ask its name, the labourer who guides the plough, or the waggoner driving his team, will tell you that it is the Pilgrim's Road to Canterbury. So the old name lives, and the memory of that famous pilgrimage which Chaucer sang has not yet died out of the people's heart. And although strangers journey no longer from afar to the martyr's shrine, it is still a pleasant thing to ride out on a spring or summer morning and follow the Pilgrim's Way, for the scenes through which it leads are fair, and the memories that it wakes belong to the noblest pages of England's story. In those old days, the pilgrims who came to Canterbury approached the Holy City by one of the three following routes. There was, first of all, the road taken by Chaucer's pilgrims from London, through Deptford, Greenwich, Rochester, and Sittingbourne, the way trodden by all who came from the north, the Midlands, and the eastern counties, and by those foreigners who, like Erasmus, had first visited London. But the greater number of the foreign pilgrims from France, Germany, and Italy landed at Sandwich Haven or Dover, and approached Canterbury from the south, while others, especially those who came from Normandy and Brittany, landed at Southampton and travelled through the southern counties of Hampshire, Surrey, and Kent. Many of these doubtless stopped at Winchester, attracted by the fame of St. Swithin, the great healing bishop, and either here or else at Guildford they would be joined by the pilgrims from the west of England on their way to the shrine of Canterbury. This was the route taken by Henry II, when, landing at Southampton on his return from France, he made his first memorable pilgrimage to the tomb of the murdered archbishop in the month of July, 1174. And this route it is which, trodden by thousands of pilgrims during the next 3 centuries, may still be clearly defined through the greater part of its course, and which in Surrey and Kent bears the historic name of the Pilgrims' Way. A very ancient path it is, far older than the days of the Plantagenets and Normans, of shrines and pilgrimages. For antiquarian researches have abundantly proved this road to be an old British track, which was in use even before the coming of the Romans. It may even have been, as some writers suppose, the road along which caravans of merchants brought their ingots of tin from Cornwall to be shipped at what was then the great harbour of Britain, the Rupitine port, afterwards Sandwich Haven, and then borne overland to Massilia and the Mediterranean shores. Ingots of tin, buried it may be in haste by merchants attacked on their journey by robbers, have, it is said, been dug up at various places along this route, and British earthworks have been found in its immediate neighbourhood. The road was, there can be no doubt, used by the Romans, and all along its course remains of Roman villas, baths, and pavements have been brought to light, together with large quantities of Roman coins, cinerary urns, and pottery of the most varied description. In medieval days, this tin road, as Mr. Grant Allen calls it, still remained the principal thoroughfare from the west to the east of England. It followed the long line of hills which runs through the north of Hampshire and across Surrey and Kent, that famous chalk ridge which has for us so many different associations, with whose scenery William Corbett, for instance, has made us all familiar in the story of his rides to and from the Wen. And it lay outside the great trackless and impassable forest of Anderida, which in those days still covered a great part of the southeast counties of England. Dean Stanley, in his eloquent account of the Canterbury pilgrimage, describes this road as a byway, and remarks that the pilgrims avoided the regular roads, probably for the same reason as in the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath. The highways were unoccupied, and the traveller walked through byways. But the statement is misleading, and there can be little doubt that in the 12th and 13th centuries this road was, if not the only means of communication between west and east, at least the principal thoroughfare across this part of England, and was as such the route naturally chosen by pilgrims to Canterbury. Certain peculiarities, it is interesting to note, mark its course from beginning to end. It clings to the hills, and, whenever it is possible, avoids the marshy ground of the valleys. It runs not on the summit of the downs, but about halfway down the hillside, where there is shelter from the wind, as well as sunshine to be had under the crest of the ridge. And its course is marked by rows of yew trees, often remarkable for their size and antiquity. Some of these are at least 700 or 800 years old, and must have reared their ancient boughs on the hillside before the feet of pilgrims ever trod these paths. So striking is this feature of the road, and so fixed is the idea that some connection exists between these yews and the Pilgrims' Way, that they are often said to have been planted with the express object of guiding travelers along the road to Canterbury. This, however, we need hardly say, is a fallacy. Yews are by no means peculiar to the Pilgrims' Way, but are to be found along every road in the chalk districts. They spring up in every old hedgerow on this soil, and are for the most part sown by the birds. But the presence of these venerable and picturesque forms does lend an undeniable charm to the ancient track, and in some places where the line of cultivation gradually spreading upwards has blotted out every other trace of the road, where the ploughshare has upturned the sod, and the hedgerows have disappeared, 3 or 4 of these grand old trees may still be seen standing by themselves in the midst of a ploughed field, the last relics of a bygone age. The murder of Becket took place on the 29th of December, 1170. At 5 o'clock on that winter evening, as the Archbishop was on his way to vespers, the king's men, Reginald Fitzurse, and 3 knights who had accompanied him from Saltwood Castle, rushed upon him with their swords, and murdered him in the north transept of his own cathedral. The tragic circumstances of Becket's end made a profound impression on the people of England, and universal horror was excited by this act of sacrilege. Whatever his faults may have been, the murdered archbishop had dared to stand up against the crown for the rights of the church, and had died rather than yield to the king's demands. "For the name of Jesus and the defense of the church, I am ready to die," were his last words as he fell under the assassin's blows. When he landed at Sandwich on his return from France, the country folk crowded to meet him, and hailed him as the father of orphans and deliverer of the oppressed, crying, "Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord." His journey to Canterbury was one long triumphal procession. The poor looked to him as their champion and defender, who had laid down his life in the cause of freedom and righteousness. Henceforth, Thomas became a national hero, and was everywhere honored as the martyr of the English. The popular belief in his holiness was confirmed by the miracles that were wrought in his name from the moment of his death. A violent storm broke over the cathedral when the fatal deed was done, and was followed by a red glow, which illuminated the choir where the dead man's body was laid before the altar. The next day the monks buried the corpse in a marble tomb behind Our Lady's altar in the Undercroft. For nearly a year no mass was said in the cathedral, no music was heard, no bells were rung. The altars were stripped of their ornaments, and the crucifixes and images were covered over. Meanwhile, reports reached Canterbury of the wonderful cures performed by the martyred archbishop. On the 3rd day after the murder, the wife of a Sussex knight, who suffered from blindness, invoked the blessed martyr's help, and was restored to sight. And on the very night of the burial, the paralytic wife of a citizen of Canterbury was cured by a garment which her husband had dipped in the murdered saint's blood. These marvels were followed by a stream of devout pilgrims who came to seek healing at the martyr's tomb, or to pay their vows for the mercies which they had received. A monk was stationed at the grave to receive offerings and report the miracles that were wrought in the chapter. At first these wonders were kept secret, for fear of the king, and of Becket's enemies, the de Brocs, whose men guarded the roads to Canterbury. The doors of the crypt were kept bolted and barred, and only the poor in the town and the neighboring villages crept to the tomb. But on Easter Day, 1171, the crowds rushed in to see a dumb man who was said to have recovered his speech, and on the following Friday the crypt was thrown open to the public. From that time, writes Benedict, the monk of Canterbury, the scene of the pool of Bethesda was daily renewed in the cathedral, and numbers of sick and helpless persons were seen to be lying on the pavement of the great church. "These great miracles are wrought," wrote John of Salisbury, an intimate friend of Becket, who became Bishop of Chartres in 1176, and was an able statesman and scholar. In the place of his passion, and in the place where he lay before the great altar before his burial, and in the tomb where he was laid at last, the blind see, the deaf hear, the dumb speak, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and a thing unheard of since the days of our fathers, the dead are raised to life. From all parts of England, the sick and suffering now crowded to Canterbury, telling the same marvelous tale, how Thomas had appeared to them robed in white, with a thin red streak of blood across his face, bringing healing and peace. In towns and villages, in castles and cottages, throughout the kingdom, writes another contemporary chronicler, everyone from the highest to the lowest wishes to visit and honor his tomb. Clerks and laymen, rich and poor, nobles and common people, fathers and mothers with their children, masters with their servants, all come hither, moved by the same spirit of devotion. They travel by day and night in winter and summer, however cold the weather may be, and the inns and hostelries on the road to Canterbury are as crowded with people as great cities are on market days. On the 21st of February, 1173, Pope Alexander III pronounced the decree of canonization and fixed the feast of St. Thomas of Canterbury on the day of the Archbishop's martyrdom. In July 1174, King Henry II, moved by the reports which reached him in Normandy of the popular enthusiasm for Becket, and fearing the effects of the divine wrath, came himself to do penance at the martyr's tomb. 3 months after the King of the English had given this public proof of his penitence and obtained release from the Church's censures, the glorious choir of Conrad was destroyed by fire on the night of September 5th, 1174. The rebuilding of the church, which was largely assisted by the offerings at Becket's tomb, was not finished until 1220, when the saint's body was removed to its final resting place in the new apse at the east end of the chapel of the Blessed Trinity, where the Archbishop had said his first Mass. On Tuesday, July 7th, an immense concourse of people of all ranks and ages assembled at Canterbury. The city and villages round, writes an eyewitness, were so filled with folk that many had to abide in tents or under the open sky. Free hospitality was given to all, and the streets of Canterbury literally flowed with wine. A stately procession, led by the young King Henry III and the patriot Archbishop Stephen Langton, entered the crypt and bore the saint's remains with solemn ceremonial to their new resting place. Here a sumptuous shrine, adorned with gold plates and precious gems, wrought by the greatest master of the craft that could be found in England, received the martyr's relics, and the new apse became known as Becket's Crown. The fame of St. Thomas now spread to all parts of the world during the next 2 centuries, and the Canterbury pilgrimage was the most popular in Christendom. The 7th of July was solemnly set apart as the feast of the translation of St. Thomas, and henceforth the splendor of this festival threw the anniversary of the actual martyrdom into the shade. The very fact that it took place in summer and not in winter naturally attracted greater numbers of pilgrims from a distance, and on the jubilees or 50th anniversaries of the translation, the concourse of people assembled at Canterbury was enormous. Besides the crowds attracted by these 2 chief festivals, pilgrims came to Canterbury in smaller parties at all seasons of the year, but more especially in the spring and summer months. Each year, as Chaucer sings, when the springtime comes round, when that April with his showers swata, the drought of Marches has pierced to the root, when Zephyrus eke with his swita brait, inspired hath in every holt and hetha, the tender crops, and small fowles maken melody, that slepen in the night with open eye, then longen folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmers for to seeken strange strandes, and specially from every shire's enda of England to Canterbury, where they wenda, the holy blissful martyr for to sake, that them hath holpen when they were sick. The passage of these caravans of pilgrims could not fail to leave its mark on the places and the people along their path. The sight of these strange faces, the news they brought, and the tales they told must have impressed the dwellers in these quiet woodlands and lonely hills, and traces of their presence remain to this day on the Surrey Downs and the lanes of Kent. They may, or may not, have been responsible for the edible variety of large white snails, Helix pomatia, commonly called Roman snails, which are found in such abundance at Albury in Surrey and at Charing in Kent, as well as at other places along the road, and which the Norman French pilgrims are traditionally said to have brought over with them. But the memory of their pilgrimage survives in the wayside chapels and shrines which sprung up along the track, in the churches which were built for their benefit, or restored and decorated by their devotion. Above all, in the local names still in common use along the countryside: Pilgrim's Lodge and Pilgrim's Ferry, Palmer's Wood, Paternoster Lane. These and similar terms still speak of the custom which had taken such fast hold of the popular mind during the 3 centuries and 50 years after the death of Becket, and recall the long processions of pilgrims which once wound over these lonely hills and through these green lanes on their way to the Martyr's shrine. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Owlivia. A very ancient path it is, far older than the days of the Plantagenets and Normans, of shrines and pilgrimages. Chapter 2 of The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Owlivia. The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury by Julia Cartwright. Chapter 2. Winchester to Alton. Few traces of the Pilgrims Way are now to be found in Hampshire, but early writers speak of an old road which led to Canterbury from Winchester, and the traveller's course would, in all probability, take them through this ancient city. Here the foreign pilgrims who landed at Southampton, and those who came from the west of England, would find friendly shelter in one or other of the religious houses, and enjoy a brief resting time before they faced the perils of the road. The old capital of Wessex, the home of Alfred, and favorite residence of Saxon and Norman kings, had many attractions to offer to the devout pilgrim. Here was the splendid golden shrine to St. Swithin, the gentle bishop who had watched over the boyhood of Alfred. In A.D. 971, 100 years after the saint's death, his bones had been solemnly removed from their resting place on the north side of the minster, where he had humbly begged to be buried, so that the sun might not shine upon him, and laid by Edgar and Dunstan behind the altar of the new cathedral which Bishop Ethelwald had raised on the site of the ancient church of Birinus. This was done, said the chronicler Withston, although the saint himself protested weeping that his body ought not to be set in God's holy church amid the splendid memorials of the ancient fathers, a legend which may have given rise to the popular tradition of the 40 days' reign and the supposed delay in the saint's funeral. From that time countless miracles were wrought at the shrine of St. Swithin, and multitudes from all parts of England flocked to seek blessing and healing at the great church which henceforth bore his name. Under the rule of Norman and Angevin kings, the venerable city had attained the height of wealth and prosperity. In those days, the population numbered some 20,000, and there are said to have been as many as 173 churches and chapels within its wall. In spite of the horrors of civil war, which twice desolated the streets in the time of Stephen and Henry III, the frequent presence of the court and the energy of her prince-bishops had made Winchester a center of religious and literary activity, and although after the death of Henry III, who throughout his long life remained faithful to his native city, royal visits became few and far between, and the old capital lost something of its brilliancy. There was still much to attract strangers and strike the imagination of the wayfarer who entered her gates in the 15th century. Few medieval cities could boast foundations of equal size and splendor. There was the strong castle of Wolversey, where the bishops reigned in state, and the royal palace by the west gate, built by King Henry III, with the fair Gothic hall which he had decorated so lavishly. There was the Hospital of St. Cross, founded by the warrior bishop Henry de Blois, and the new College of St. Mary, which William of Wykeham, the great master builder, had reared in the meadows known as the Greenery, or promenade of the monks of St. Swithin. Another venerable hospital, that of St. John's, claimed to have been founded by Birinus, and on Morn Hill, just outside the East Gate, stood a hospital for lepers, dedicated to St. Mary Magdalene. There, conspicuous among a crowd of religious houses by their wealth and antiquity, were the two great Benedictine communities of St. Swithin and Hyde. And there, too, was the grand Norman church, which the Conqueror's kinsman, Bishop Walchelin, had raised on the ruins of Ethelwald's Minster, with its low, massive tower and noble transepts, and the long nave roofed in with solid trees of oak, cut down in Hempage wood. 3 centuries later, William of Wykeham transformed the nave after the latest fashion of architecture, cut through the old Norman work, carried up the piers to a lofty height, and replaced the flat wooden roof by fine stone groining. But the Norman tower and transepts of Bishop Walkelin's church still remain today almost unchanged. So great was the concourse of pilgrims to St. Swithin's shrine in the early part of the 14th century that Bishop Godfrey Lucy enlarged the eastward portion of the church and built, as it were, another church with nave, aisles, and lady chapel of its own under the same roof. The monks had no great love for the lower classes of pilgrims who thronged their doors, and took good care to keep them out of the conventual precincts. They were only allowed to enter the minster by a doorway in the north transept, and, once they had visited the shrine and duly made their offerings, they were jealously excluded from the rest of the church by those fine ironwork gates still preserved in the cathedral, and said to be the oldest specimen of the kind in England. Towards the close of the century, in the reign of Edward I, the fine old building, still known as the Strangers' Hall, was built by the monks of St. Swithin at their convent gate for the reception of the poorer pilgrims. Here they found food and shelter for the night. They slept, ate their meals, and drank their ale, and made merry round one big central fire. The hall is now divided, and is partly used as the dean's stable, partly enclosed in a canon's house. But traces of rudely carved heads, a bearded king, and a nun's face are still visible on the massive timbers of the vaulted roof, blackened with the smoke of bygone ages. In the morning, the same pilgrims would wend their way to the doors of the prior's lodging, and stand under the 3 beautiful pointed arches which form the entrance to the present deanery, would there receive alms in money, and fragments of bread and meat to help them on their journey. The route which they took on leaving Winchester is uncertain. It is not till we approach Alton that we find the first traces of the Pilgrims' Way, but in all probability they followed the Roman road, which still leads to Silchester and London along the valley of the river Itchen. Immediately outside the city gates, they would find themselves before another stately pile of conventual buildings, the great Abbey of Hyde. This famous Benedictine house, founded by Alfred, and long known as the New Minster, was first removed from its original site near the cathedral in the 12th century. Finding their house damp and unhealthy, and feeling themselves cramped in the narrow space close to the rival monastery of St. Swithin, the monks obtained a charter from Henry I, giving them leave to settle outside the north gate. In the year 1110, they moved to their new home, bearing with them the wonder-working shrine of St. Jos, the great silver cross given to the new minster by Knut, and a yet more precious relic, the bones of Alfred the Great. Here in the green meadows on the banks of the Itchen, they reared the walls of their new convent and the magnificent church, which, after being in the next reign burnt to the ground by fireballs from Henry of Blow's castle at Wolvesey, rose again from the flames, fairer and richer than before. Here it stood until the dissolution, when Thomas Wriothesley, Cromwell's commissioner, stripped the shrine of its treasures, carried off the gold and jewels, and pulled down the abbey walls to use the stone in building of his own great house at Stratton. "We intend," he wrote to his master, after describing the riches of gold and silver plate, the crosses studded with pearls, chalices, and emeralds on which he had laid sacrilegious hands, "both at Hyde and St. Mary, to sweep away all the rotten bones that be called relics, which we may not omit, lest it be thought we came more for the treasure than for the avoiding of the abomination of idolatry." Considerable fragments of the building still remained. In Milner's time, the ruins covered the whole meadow. But towards the end of the last century, the city authorities fixed on the spot as the site of a new bridewell, and all that was left of the once famous abbey was then destroyed. The tombs of the dead were rifled. At every stroke of the spade some ancient sepulchre was violated. Stone coffins containing chalices, croziers, rings were broken open, and bones scattered abroad. Then the ashes of the noblest of our kings were blown to the winds, and the resting place of Alfred remains to this day unknown. A stone marked with the words Alfred Rex, 881, was carried off by a passing stranger, and is now to be seen at Corby Castle in Cumberland. Today, an old gateway near the church of St. Bartholomew and some fragments of the monastery wall are the only remains of Alfred's new minster. From this spot an ancient causeway, now commonly known as the Nuns' Walk, but which in the last century bore the more correct title of the Monks' Walk, leads alongside of a stream which supplied Hyde Abbey with water, for 1.5 miles up the valley to Headbourne Worthy. The path is cool and shady, planted with a double row of tall elms, and as we look back, we have beautiful views of the venerable city and the great cathedral sleeping in the quiet hollow, dreaming of all its mighty past. Above, scarred with the marks of a deep railway cutting, and built over with new houses, is St. Giles Hill, where, during many centuries, the famous fair was held each September. Foreign pilgrims would gaze with interest on the scene of that yearly event, which had attained a worldwide fame, and attracted merchants from all parts of France, Flanders, and Italy. The green hillside from which we looked down on the streets and towers of Winchester presented a lively spectacle during that fortnight. The stalls were ranged in long rows and called after the nationality of the vendors of the goods they sold. There was a street of Caen, of Limoges, of the Flemings, of the Genoese, the drapery, the goldsmith's stall, the spicery, held by monks of St. Swithin, who drove a brisk trade in furs and groceries on these occasions. All shops in the city, and for 7 leagues round, were closed during the fair, and local trade was entirely suspended. The mayor handed over the keys of the city, for the time being, to the bishop, who had large profits from the tolls and had stalls at the fair himself, while smaller portions went to the abbeys, and 30 marks a year were paid to St. Swithin's for the repair of the great church. The Red King first granted his kinsman, Bishop Walkelin, the tolls of this 3 days' fair at St. Giles' feast, which privilege was afterwards extended to a period of 16 days by Henry III. The great fair lasted until modern times, but in due course was removed from St. Giles' Hill into the city itself. As the city grew stronger and the fair weaker, writes Dean Kitchen, it slid down St. Giles' Hill and entered the town, where its noisy ghost still holds revel once a year. Leaving these historic memories behind us, we follow the Monks' Walk until we reach Headbourne Worthy, the first of a group of villages granted by Egbert in 825 to St. Swithin's Priory, and bearing this quaint name, derived from the Saxon Werth, a homestead. The church here dates from Saxon times and claims to have been founded by St. Wilfrid. The rude west doorway and chancel arch are said to belong to Edward the Confessor's time. Over the west archway, which now leads into a 15th century chapel, is a fine sculptured bas-relief, larger than life, representing the Crucifixion and the Marys, which probably originally adorned the exterior of the church. But the most interesting thing in the church is the brass to John Kent, a Winchester scholar, who died in 1434. The boy wears his college gown and his hair is closely cut, while a scroll comes out of his lips bearing the words, Misericordiam Domini in aeternum cantabo. I will sing forever the mercy of God. Next we reach Kingsworthy, so called because it was once crown property, a pretty little village with low square, ivy-grown church tower and lich gate, and a charming old-fashioned inn standing a little back from the road. The third of the Worthies, Abbotsworthy, is now united to Kingsworthy. Passing through its little street of houses, a mile farther on, we reach Martyrsworthy, a still smaller village with another old Norman church and low thatched cottages, picturesquely placed near the banks of the river, which is here crossed by a wooden footbridge. But all this part of the Itchen Valley has the same charm. Everywhere we find the same old farmhouses with mullioned windows and sundials and yew trees, the same straggling roofs brilliant with yellow lichen, and the same cottages and gardens gay with lilies and phloxes, the same green lanes shaded with tall elms and poplars, the same low chalk hills and wooded distances closing in the valley, and below the bright river winding its way through the cool meadows. The Itchen, the beautiful Itchen Valley, exclaims Corbett, as he rides along this vale of meadows. There are few spots in England more fertile or more pleasant, none, I believe, more healthy. The fertility of this vale and of the surrounding country is best proved by the fact that, besides the town of Alsford and that of Southampton, there are 17 villages, each having its parish church upon its borders. When we consider these things, we are not surprised that a spot situated about halfway down this vale should have been chosen for the building of a city, or that city should have been for a great number of years the place of residence for the kings of England. Towards the Itchen Abbas of the abbot, the valley opens, and we see the noble avenues and spreading beaches of Abington Park, long the property of the Dukes of Chandos, and often visited by Charles II while Wren was building his red-brick palace at Winchester. Here the merry monarch feasted his friends in a banqueting hall that is now a greenhouse, and a room in the old house bore the name of Nell Gwyn's Closet. In those days it was the residence of the notorious Lady Shrewsbury, afterwards the wife of George Bryges, a member of the Chandos family. The lady whose first husband, Francis, Earl of Shrewsbury, was slain fighting in a duel with George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, while the Countess herself, disguised as a page, held her lover's horse. The river winds through the park, and between the overarching boughs of the forest trees we catch lovely glimpses of wood and water. In the opposite direction, but also close to Itchen Abbas, is another well-known seat, Lord Ashburton's famous Grange, often visited by Carlyle. Here the dark tints of yew and fir mingle with the bright hues of lime and beech and silver oaks on the banks of a clear lake, and long grassy glades lead up to wild gorse-grown slopes of open down. Still following the river banks, we reach Itchenstoke, another picturesque village with timbered cottages and mossy roofs. A little modern church, with high-pitched roof and lancet windows, having a curiously foreign air, stands among the tall pines on a steep bank above the stream. But here our pleasant journey along the fair Itchen Valley comes to an end, and leaving the riverside, we climb the hilly road which leads us into Alresford. New Alresford, a clean, bright little town, with broad street planted with rows of trees, boasts an antiquity which belies its name. It has been a market town and a borough from time immemorial. Like its yet more venerable neighbour, Old Alresford, it was given by a king of the West Saxons to the prior and monks of St. Swithin at Winchester, and formed part of the vast possessions of the monastery at the Conquest. Both places took their name from their situation on a ford of the Arle, or Alra, River, a considerable stream which joins the Itchen below Abington, and is called by Leland the Alresford River. In the 11th century, New Alresford had fallen into decay, and probably owes its present existence to Bishop Godfrey Lucy, who rebuilt the town and obtained a charter from King John, restoring the market, which had fallen into disuse. At the same time, he gave the town the name of Newmarket, but the older one survived, and the bishop's new title was never generally adopted. The same energetic prelate bestowed a great deal of care and considerable attention on the water supply of Winchester, and made the Itchen navigable all the way from Southampton to Alresford. In recognition of this important service, Bishop Lucy received from King John the right of levying toll on all leather, hides, and other goods, which entered Winchester by the river Itchen through this canal, a right which descended to his successors in the sea. Southwest of the town is the large pond or reservoir which he made to supply the waters of the Itchen. This lake, which still covers about 60 acres, is a well-known haunt of moorhens and other waterfowl, and the flags and bulrushes which fringe its banks make it a favorable resort of artists. Old Alresford itself, with its gay flower gardens, tall elms, pretty old thatched cottages grouped round the village green, may well supply them with more than one subject for pen and pencil. New Alresford was at one time a flourishing centre of the cloth trade, in which the Winchester merchants drove so brisk a trade at St. Giles Fair. The manufacture of woolen cloth was carried on till quite recent times, and Dean Kitchen tells us that there are old men still living who remember driving with their fathers to the fair at Winchester on St. Giles' Day to buy a roll of blue cloth to provide the family suits for the year. But New Alresford shared the decline as it had shared the prosperity of its more important neighbour, and suffered even more severely than Winchester in the Civil Wars, when the town was almost entirely burnt down by Lord Hopton's troops after their defeat in Cheriton fight. The scene of that hard-fought battle, which gave Winchester into Waller's hands and ruined the king's cause in the west of England, lies a few miles to the south of Alresford. Halfway between the two is Tichborne Park, the seat of a family which has owned this estate from the days of Harold, and which took its name from the stream flowing through the parish, and called the Ticheborne in Anglo-Saxon records. In modern times, a well-known case has given Tichborne an unenviable notoriety, but members of this ancient house have been illustrious at all periods of our history, and the legend of the Tichborne Dole, so long associated with the spot, deserves to be remembered. In the reign of Henry I, Isabella, the wife of Sir Roger Tichborne, a lady whose long life had been spent in deeds of mercy, prayed her husband as she lay dying to grant her as much land as would enable her to give a dole of bread for all who asked alms at the gates of Tichborne on each succeeding Lady Day. Sir Roger was a knight of sterner stuff, and seizing a flaming brand from the hearth, he told his wife jestingly that she might have as much land as she could herself walk over before the burning torch went out. Upon which the sick lady caused herself to be borne from her bed to a piece of ground within the manor, and crawled on her hands and knees until she had encircled 23 acres. The actual plot of ground still bears the name of Lady Tichborne's Crawls, and there was an old prophecy which said that the house of Tichborne would only last as long as the dying bequest of Isabella was carried out. During the next 6 centuries, 1,900 small loaves were regularly distributed to the poor at the gates on Ladies' Day, and a miraculous virtue was supposed to belong to bread thus bestowed. The custom was only abandoned 100 years ago, owing to the number of idlers and bad characters which it brought into the neighborhood, and a sum of money equal in amount to the dole is given to the poor of the parish in its stead. Whether any of our Canterbury pilgrims stopped in their course to avail themselves of the Tichborne dole, we cannot say, but there was a manor house of the bishops of Winchester at Bishop Sutton, near Alresford, where they would, no doubt, find food and shelter. Nothing now remains of the episcopal palace, and no trace of its precincts is preserved but the site of the bishop's kennels. After crossing the river at Alresford, the pilgrims turned northeast, and, according to an old tradition, their road led them through the parish of Ropley, a neighboring village where Roman remains have been discovered. A little further on the same track, close to Rotherford Park, where the modern mansion of Pelham now stands, was an ancient house which bore the name of Pilgrim's Place, and is indicated as such in old maps. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Owlivia.
Chapter 3 of The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury by Julia Cartwright. Chapter 3. Alton to Compton. A few miles to the right of the road is a place which no pilgrim of modern times can leave unvisited. Selborne. White's Selborne, the home of the gentle naturalist whose memory haunts these rural scenes. Here he lived in the picturesque house overgrown with creepers, with the sunny garden and dial at the back, and the great spreading oak where he loved to study the ways of the owls, and the juniper tree, which, to his joy, survived the Siberian winter of 1776. And here he died, and lies buried in the quiet churchyard in the shade of the old yew tree, where he so often stood to watch his favourite birds. Not a stone but what speaks of him, not a turn in the village street but has its tale to tell. The Plaistow, or village green, which Adam de Gurdon granted to the Augustinian canons of Selborne in the 13th century, where the prior held his market of old, and where young and old met on summer evenings under the big oak, and sat in quiet debate, or frolicked and danced before him, the farmhouse, which now marks the site of the ancient priory itself, founded by Peter de Rupibus, Bishop of Winchester, in 1232, he has described them all. How the good canons grew lazy and secular in their ways after a time, how William of Wykeham found certain of them professed hunters and sportsmen, and tried in vain to reform them, and how the estates were finally handed over to the new college of St. Mary Magdalene at Oxford by its founder, William of Waynflete, Gilbert White has already told us. The Hanger, with its wooded slopes, rising from the back of his garden, and that noble chalk promontory of Nor Hill, planted with the beeches which he called the most lovely of all forest trees. How familiar they seem to us. Still the swifts wheel to and fro round the low church tower, and the crickets chirp in the long grass, and the white owl is heard at night, just as when he used to linger under the old walls and watch their manners with infinite care and love. One of the rocky hollow lanes which lead towards Alton will take us back into the road and bring us to Chawton, a village about a mile from that town. The fine Elizabethan manor house at the foot of the green knoll, and the grey church peeping out of the trees close by, have been for centuries the home and burial place of the knights. On the south side of the chancel, a black and white marble monument records the memory of that gallant cavalier, Sir Richard Knight, who risked life and fortune in the royal cause, and was invested with the Order of the Royal Oak by Charles II after the Restoration. But it is as the place where Jane Austen, in George Eliot's opinion the greatest artist that has ever written, composed her novels, that Chawton is memorable. The cottage where she lived is still standing a few hundred yards from the great house, which was the home of the brother and nieces to whom she was so fondly attached. She and her sister, Cassandra, settled there in 1809, and remained there until May 1817, when they moved to the corner house of College Street, Winchester, where 3 months afterwards she died. During the 8 years spent in this quiet home, Jane Austen attained the height of her powers, and wrote her most famous novels, those works which she herself cost her so little, and which, in Tennyson's words, have given her a place in English literature next to Shakespeare. Sense and Sensibility, her first novel, was published 2 years after the move to Chawton. Persuasion, the last and most finished of the immortal series, was only written in 1816, a year before her death. Seldom, indeed, has so great a novelist led so retired an existence. The life at Chawton, so smooth in its even flow, with the daily round of small excitements and quiet pleasures, the visits to the great house and walks with her nieces in the woods, the shopping expeditions to Alton, the talk about new bonnets and gowns, and the latest news as to the births, deaths, and marriages of the numerous relatives in Kent and Hampshire, are faithfully reflected in those pleasant letters of Jane Austen, which her great-nephew, Lord Brabourne, gave to the world. There is a good deal about her flowers, her chickens, her niece's love affairs, the fancy work on which she is engaged, the improvements in the house and garden. "You cannot imagine," she writes on one occasion, "it is not in human nature to imagine what a nice walk we have round the orchard." But very little indeed about her books. Almost the only allusion we find to one of her characters is in 1816, when she writes to Fanny Knight of Anne Elliot in Persuasion. "You may perhaps like the heroine, as she is almost too good for me." Anything like fame or publicity was positively distasteful to her. She owns to feeling absolutely terrified when a lady in town asks to be introduced to her, and then adds laughingly, "If I am a wild beast, I cannot help it. It's not my fault." Curiously enough, the Pilgrims Way, in the later course of its path, brings us to Godmersham, that other and finer home of the Knights of the Kentish Downs, a place also associated with Jane Austen's life and letters, where she spent many pleasant hours in the midst of her family, enjoying the beauty of the spot and its cheerful surroundings. But Chawton retains the supremacy as her own home, and as the scene of those literary labours that were cut short, alas, too soon. "What a pity," Sir Walter Scott exclaimed after reading a book of hers, "what a pity such a gifted creature died so early." From Chawton it is a short mile to Alton, famous for its breweries and hop gardens, and its church door, riddled with the bullets of the Roundheads. Our way now leads us through the woods of Alice Holt, Aishult, the Ash Wood, like Woolmer, a royal forest from Saxon times. Alice Holt was renowned for the abundance of its fallow deer, which made it a favourite hunting ground with the Plantagenet kings, and on one occasion Edward II, it is said, gave one of his scullions, Maurice Ken, the sum of 20 shillings because he fell from his horse so often out hunting, which made the king laugh exceedingly. Here too, after the Battle of Evesham, Edward, Prince of Wales, defeated Adam de Gurdon, one of Simon de Montfort's chief followers. He is said to have challenged the rebel baron to a single combat, in which Gurdon was wounded and made prisoner. But the victor spared his life, and afterwards obtained a royal pardon for his vanquished foe. A wild, rugged tract of country, Alice Holt was a chosen haunt of robbers and outlaws, the terror of the wealthier London merchants who journeyed to St. Giles' Fair at Winchester, and in the 14th century the wardens of the fair kept 5 mounted sergeants-at-arms in the forest near Alton for their protection at that season. Soon after leaving Alton, the pilgrims would catch their first sight of the River Way, which rises close to the town. Along the banks of this stream, flowing as it does through some of the loveliest Surrey scenery, their road was now to lie, and not until they crossed St. Catherine's Ferry at Guildford were they finally to lose sight of its waters. The river itself, more than one writer has suggested, may owe its name to this circumstance, and have originally been called the Way River from the ancient road which followed the early part of its course. Leaving Froyle Park, Sir Hubert Miller's fine Jacobean house, on our left, we pass Bentley Station, and still following the river, join the Portsmouth Road just before entering Farnham. This town, which takes its name from the commons overgrown with fern and heather still to be seen in the neighbourhood on the Surrey side, is now surrounded with hop gardens. It was among the earliest possessions of the Bishops of Winchester, and formed part of the land granted to St. Swithin in 860 by Alfred's elder brother, Ethelbald, King of Wessex. The Castle Palace, which still looks proudly down on the streets of the little town, was first built by that magnificent prelate Henry of Blois, but little of the original building now remains except the offices, where some round Norman pillars may still be seen. Farnham Castle was partly destroyed by Henry III during his wars with the barons, and suffered greatly at the hands of the rebels in the time of Charles I, but was afterwards rebuilt by Bishop Morley. Queen Elizabeth paid frequent visits here, and on one occasion, while dining in the Great Hall with the Duke of Norfolk, who was suspected of planning a marriage with Mary Queen of Scots, pleasantly advised the Duke to be careful on what pillow he laid his head. The lawn, with its stately cedars and grass-grown moat, deserves a visit, but the most interesting part of the building is the fine old keep, with its massive buttresses and 13th-century arches, commanding a wide view over the elm avenues of the park and the commons which stretch eastward on the Surrey side. Prominent in the foreground are the picturesque heights of Crooksbury, crowned with those tall pines which Cobbett climbed when he was a boy to take the nests of crows and magpies. Farnham, it must be remembered, was the birthplace of this remarkable man, and it was at Ash, a small town at the foot of the Hog's Back, that he died in 1835. All his life long he retained the fondest affection for these scenes of his youth. In 1825 he brought his son Richard, then a boy of 11, to see the little old house in the street where he had lived with his grandmother, and showed him the garden at Waverley, where he worked as a lad, the tree near the abbey from which he fell into the river in a perilous attempt to take a crow's nest, and the strawberry beds, where he gathered strawberries for Sir Robert Rich's table, taking care to eat the finest. Among these hills and commons, where he followed the hounds on foot at 10 years old and rode across country at 70, we forget the political aspect of his life, his bitter invectives against the poor laws and paper money, the national debt and the system, and think rather of his keen love of nature and delight in the heaths, the sandy coppices and forests of Surrey and Hampshire. and now he sleeps in the church of Farnham, where he desired to be buried, in the heart of the wild scenery which he loved so well. Just under Crooksbury, that grand scene of Cobbett's exploits, lies Moor Park, the retreat of Sir William Temple in his old age, which seemed to him, to quote his own words, "the sweetest place, I think, that I have ever seen in my life, either before or since, at home or abroad." There we may still see the gardens which the statesman of the Triple Alliance laid out after the fashion of those which he remembered in Holland, where he enjoyed the companionship of his beloved sister, Lady Gifford, and where his heart lies buried under the sundial. Here Swift lived as his secretary, and learnt from King William III how to cut asparagus. Here he wrote The Tale of the Tub, and made love to Mrs. Hester Johnson, Lady Gifford's pretty, black-eyed waiting-maid. The memory of that immortal love story has not yet perished, and the house where she lived is still known as Stella's Cottage. Here too, just beyond Moor Park, on the banks of the Wey, are the ruins of Waverley Abbey, the first Cistercian house ever founded in England, often described as Le Petit Citeau, and the mother of many other abbeys. The more distinguished pilgrims who stopped at Farnham would taste the hospitality of the monks of Waverley, and Henry III was on one occasion their guest. The abbot of Waverley, too, was a great personage in these parts, and his influence extended over several parishes through which the pilgrims had to pass, although the privileges which he claimed were often disputed by the prior of Newark, the other ecclesiastical magnate who reigned in this part of Surrey. Pilgrims of humbler rank would find ample accommodation in the ancient hostelries of Farnham, which was at that time a place of considerable importance, and returned 2 members to Edward II's Parliament. Their onward course now lay along the banks of the Wey, until they reached the foot of the narrow, curiously shaped chalk ridge known as the Hog's Back. Here, at a place called Whiteway End, the end of the White Chalk Road, 2 roads divide. Both lead to Guildford, the one keeping on the crest of the ridge, the other along its southern slope. The upper road has become an important thoroughfare in modern times, and is now the main road from Farnham to Guildford. The lower is a grassy lane, not always easy to follow, and little used in places, which leads through the parishes of Seal, Partenham, and Compton, the bright little villages which stud the sides of the Hog's Back. This green woodland path under the downs was the ancient British and Roman track along which the Canterbury pilgrims journeyed, and which is still in some places spoken of by the inhabitants as the Way. Other names in local use bear the same witness. Beggar's Corner and Robbers or Romer's Moor are supposed to owe their appellations to the pilgrims, while the ivy-grown manor house of Shewlands, bearing the date of 1616 on its porch, is said to take its name from the word to shule, which in some dialects has the same meaning as to beg. Another trace of the pilgrimage is to be found in the local fairs, which are still held in the towns and villages along the road, and which were fixed at those periods of the year when the pilgrims would be either going to Canterbury or returning from there. Thus we find that at Guildford the chief fair took place at Christmas, when the pilgrims would be on their way to the winter festival of St. Thomas, and was only altered to September in 1312, by which time the original day of the saint's martyrdom had ceased to be as popular as the summer feast. Again, the great fair at Shalford was fixed for the Feast of the Assumption, the 15th of August, so as to catch the stream of pilgrims which flowed back from Canterbury after the Feast of the Translation in July, and the 7 days' fair there that went by the name of Becket's Fair. Fairs soon came to be held not only at towns such as Farnham, Guildford and Shalford, but at the small villages along the Pilgrims' Road. There was one in the churchyard at Puttenham, and another at Wanborough, a church on the northern side of the hill, which belonged to Waverley Abbey, where the offerings made by the pilgrims formed part of the payments yearly received by the abbot, while a third was held on St. Catherine's Hill during 5 days in September. Even the churches along the road often owed their existence to the pilgrimage. The Church of Seal was built early in the 13th century by the abbots of Waverley, and that of Wanborough was rebuilt by the same abbots, and was again allowed to fall into decay when the days of pilgrimages were over. Both the sister chapels of St. Catherine and St. Martha, we shall see, owed their restoration to the Pilgrim's Passage, and many more along the way were either raised in honour of St. Thomas or else adorned with frescoes and altarpieces of the martyrdom. Along this pleasant Surrey hillside the old Canterbury pilgrims journeyed, going from church to church, from shrine to shrine, and more especially if their pilgrimage took place in summer, enjoying the sweet country air and leafy shades of this quiet woodland region. They lingered, we may well believe, at the village fairs, and stopped at every town to see the sights and hear the news, for the pilgrim of medieval days was, as Dean Stanley reminds us, a traveller with the same adventures, stories, pleasures, pains as the traveller of our own times, and men of every type and class set out on pilgrimages much as tourists today start on a foreign trip. Some, no doubt, undertook the journey from devotion, and more in a vague hope of reaping some profit, both material and spiritual, from a visit to the shrine of the all-powerful saint, while 1,000 other motives, curiosity, love of change and adventure, the pleasure of a journey, prompted the crowds who thronged the road at certain seasons of the year. Chaucer's company of pilgrims, we know, was a motley crew, and included men and women whose characters were as varied as their rank and trade. With them came a throng of jugglers and story-tellers and minstrels, who beguiled the way with music and laughter as they rode or walked along, so that every town they came through, what with the noise of their singing, and with the sound of their piping, and with the jangling of their Canterbury bells, and with the barking of their dogs after them, they made more noise than if the king came there with all his clarions. In their train, too, a crowd of idle folk, of roving pedlars and begging friars and lazy tramps, who were glad of any excuse to beg a crust or coin. The presence of these last was by no means always welcome at the inns and religious houses on the road, where doubtful characters often craved admittance, knowing that if the hand of justice overtook them, they could always find refuge in one of those churches where the rights of sanctuary were so resolutely claimed and so jealously defended by the Abbot of Waverley or the Prior of Newark. End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of the Pilgrims Way, from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Pilgrims Way, from Winchester to Canterbury, by Julia Cartwright. Chapter 4. Compton to Shalford. Following the Pilgrims Way along the southern slopes of the Hog's Back, we crossed Puttenham Heath and reached the pretty little village of Compton. Here, nestling under the downs, a few hundred yards from the track, is a beautiful old 12th century church, which was there before the days of St. Thomas. This ancient structure, dedicated to St. Nicholas, still retains some good stained glass and boasts a unique feature in the shape of a double-storied chancel. The east end of the church is crossed by a low semicircular arch enriched with Norman zigzag moulding and surmounted by a rude screen, which is said to be the oldest piece of woodwork in England. Both the upper and the lower sanctuaries have piscinas, and there is an early English one in the south aisle. The massive bases of the chalk pillars, the altar tomb north of the chancel, probably an Eastern sepulchre, and a hagioscope now blocked up, all deserve attention, as well as the fine Jacobean pulpit and chancel screen, which is now placed under the Tower Arch. A mile to the west of this singularly interesting church is Loseley, the historic mansion of the More and Molyneux family. This manor was crown property in the reign of Edward the Confessor, and is described in Domesday Book as the property of the Norman Roger de Montgomery, Earl of Shrewsbury, on whom it was bestowed by the Conqueror. After passing through many hands, it was finally bought from the Earl of Gloucester, early in the 16th century, by Sir Christopher More, whose son, Sir William, built the present mansion. The grand old house, with its grey stone gables and mullioned windows, is a perfect specimen of Elizabethan architecture. The broad grass terrace along the edge of the moat, the yew hedges with their glossy hues of green and purple, the old-fashioned borders full of bright flowers, and the low pigeon-houses standing at each angle, all remain as they were in the reign of James I, and agree well with Lord Bacon's idea of what a pleasance ought to be. Within, the walls are wainscoted with oak panelling throughout, and the ceilings and mantelpieces are richly decorated. The cross and mulberry tree of the Moors, with their mottos, may still be seen in the stained glass oriel of the great hall and on the cornices of the drawing-room. Here too is a fine mantelpiece, carved in white chalk, which is said to have been designed by Hans Holbein. Many are the royal visitors who have left memorials of their presence at Loseley. Queen Elizabeth had an especial affection for the place, and was here 3 times. The cushioned seats of 2 gilt chairs were worked by her needle, and there is a painted panel bearing the quaint device of a flower pot with the red and white roses of York and Lancaster, and the fleur-de-lis, with the words Rosa Electa and Felicior Fenice, a pretty conceit which would not fail to find favour in the eyes of the Virgin Queen. The hall contains portraits of James I and his wife Anne of Denmark, painted by Mytons in honour of a visit which they paid to Loseley in the first year of this monarch's reign, and the ceiling of His Majesty's bedroom is elaborately patterned over with stucco reliefs of Tudor roses and lilies and thistles. A likeness of Anne Boleyn and several fine portraits of members of the More family also adorn the walls, and there is a beautiful little picture of the boy king, Edward VI, wearing an embroidered crimson doublet and jewelled cap and feather, painted by some clever pupil of Holbein in 1547. This portrait was sent in 1890 to the Tudor exhibition, which also contained many historical documents relating to different personages of this royal line, preserved among the Loseley manuscripts. There are warrants signed by Edward VI, the Lord Protector, by Queen Elizabeth and the Lord of her Council, including Hatton, the Lord Chancellor, Cecil, Lord Burleigh, Lord Effingham, and Lord Derby. There is one of 1540, signed by Henry VIII, commanding Christopher More, Sheriff of the County of Sussex, to deliver certain goods forfeited to the Crown to Catherine Howard, one of our Queen's maidens, and another, signed by Elizabeth in the first year of her reign, commanding William More to raise and equip 100 able men for the defence of England against foreign invasion. There is also a curious sumptuary proclamation by Queen Elizabeth respecting the dress and ornaments of women, and, what is still more rare and interesting, a warrant from Lady Jane Grey, dated July the 19th, I, Jane, and signed Jane the Queen. Among the more private and personal papers is an amusing letter from Robert Horne, Bishop of Winchester, giving Mr. More of Loseley advice as to stocking the new pond with the best kind of carp. These be of a little head, broad side, and not long, such as be great-headed and long, made after the fashion of a herring, are not good, neither will ever be. Another from Bishop Day informs Sir William More, in 1596, that he intends to fish the little pond at Frensham, while one to the same gentleman, from Alexander Nowell, Dean of St. Paul's, thanks him for his exertions to recover a stolen nag on his behalf. The treasures of Loseley, in fact, are as inexhaustible as its beauty. A pleasant walk through the forest trees and grassy glades of the park leads us back to Compton village and the green lanes through which the Pilgrims Way now wanders. Skirting the grounds of Monk's Hatch, with their pine groves and rose gardens lying under the chalk hanger, the old road passes close to Limnalees, the Surrey home of George Frederick Watts. Today, thousands of pilgrims from all parts of the world seek out this sylvan retreat where the great master spent his last years, and visit the treasures of art which adorn its galleries, and the fair chapel and cloister that mark the painter's grave. From Compton, a path known as Sandy Lane leads over the hill past Brayburf Manor and the site of the old roadside shrine of Littleton Cross, and comes out on the open down close to the chapel of St. Catherine. This now ruined shrine, which stands on a steep bank near the road, was rebuilt on the site of a still older one in 1317 by Richard de Wantsey, rector of St. Nicholas, Guildford, and was much frequented by pilgrims to Canterbury. So valuable were the revenues derived by the parson from their offerings that the original grant made to Richard de Wantsey was disputed, and for some years the rector of St. Mary stepped into his rights. But in 1329 the rector of St. Nicholas succeeded in ousting his rival, and the chapel was reconsecrated and attached to the parish of St. Nicholas. An old legend ascribes the building of this shrine and of the chapel on St. Martha's Hill to two giant sisters of primeval days, who raised the walls with their own hands and flung their enormous hammer backwards and forwards from one hill to the other. Unlike its more fortunate sister shrine, St. Catherine's Chapel has long been roofless and dismantled, but it still forms a very picturesque object in the landscape, and the pointed arches of its broken windows frame in lovely views of the green meadows of the winding way, with the castle and churches of Guildford at our feet, and the hills and commons stretching far away to the blue ridge of Hindhead. The ancient city of Guildford owes its name and much of its historic renown to its situation on the chief ford of the River Way, which here makes a break in the ridge of chalk downs running across Surrey. Guildford is mentioned in his will by King Alfred, who left it to his nephew Ethelwold, and became memorable as the spot where another Alfred, the son of Nut and Emma, was treacherously seized and murdered by Earl Godwin, who, standing on the eastern slope of the Hog's Back above the city, bade the young prince look back and see how large a kingdom would be his. For 7 centuries, from the days of the Saxon kings to those of the Stuarts, Guildford remained crown property, and the Norman keep, which still towers grandly above the city, was long a royal palace. The strength of the castle and importance of the position made it famous in the wars of the barons, and the Waverley annalist records its surrender to Louis VIII of France when he marched against King John from Sandwich Haven to Winchester. Today, the picturesqueness of the streets, the gabled roofs and panelled houses, and even more the situation of the town in the heart of this fair district, attract many artists and make it a favourite centre for tourists. In medieval times, Guildford was a convenient halting place for pilgrims on their way from the south and west of England to the shrine of St. Thomas. Many of these, however, as the shrewd parson of St. Nicholas saw when he thought it worth his while to buy the freehold of the site on which St. Catherine's Chapel stood, would push on and cross the river by the ferry at the foot of the hill, which still bears the name of the Pilgrims' Ferry. On landing, they found themselves in the parish of Shalford, in the meadows where the great fair was held each year in August. When the original charter was granted by King John, the fair took place in the churchyard, but soon the concourse of people became so great that it spread into the fields along the river and covered as much as 140 acres of ground. Shalford Fair seems, in fact, to have been the most important one in this part of Surrey, and no doubt owed its existence to the passage of the Canterbury Pilgrims. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the Pilgrims Way, from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Pilgrims Way, from Winchester to Canterbury, by Julia Cartwright. Chapter 5. Shalford to Albury. The line of the Pilgrims Way may be clearly followed from the banks of the way up the hill. It goes through Shalford Park, up Cider House Lane, where the ancient pest house, or refuge for sick pilgrims and travellers, now called Cider House Cottage, is still standing, and leads through the Chantry Woods straight to St. Martha's Chapel. The district through which it takes us is one of the wildest and loveliest parts of Surrey. Very few prettier rides in England, remarks Cobbett, who repeatedly travelled along this track, and the beauty of the views all along its course will more than repay the traveller who makes his way on foot over the hills from Guildford to Dorking. One of the most extensive is to be had from St. Martha's Hill, where the prospect ranges in one direction over South Leith Hill and the South Downs, far away to the Weald of Sussex and the well-known clump of Chanctonbury Ring, and on the other over the commons and moors to the crests of Hindhead and the Hog's Back, while looking northward we have a wide view over the Surrey Plains and the valley of the Thames, and Windsor Castle and the dome of St. Paul's may be distinguished on clear days. The ancient chapel on the summit, which gives its name to St. Martha's Hill, was originally built in memory of certain Christians who suffered martyrdom on the spot, and was formerly dedicated to all holy martyrs, while the hill itself was known as the Martyr's Hill, of which, as Gross remarks, the present name is supposed to be a corruption. In the 12th century it became peculiarly associated with the Canterbury Pilgrims, and a new chancel was built for their use, and consecrated to St. Thomas a Becket in the year 1186. In 1262 this chapel was attached to the Priory of Newark, an Augustinian convent near Ripley, dedicated to St. Thomas of Canterbury by Roald de Calva in the reign of Richard Coeur de Lion. The prior already owned most of the hillside, and the names of Farthing Copse and Halfpenny Lane, through which the pilgrims passed on their way to St. Martha's Chapel, remind us of the tolls which he levied from all who travelled along the road. We have already seen how in the earlier portions of the way the Prior of Newark disputed the rights of the Abbot of Waverley. Here he reigned supreme. A priest from Newark Priory served St. Martha's Chapel, and is said to have lived at Titings Farm, an old gabled house with the remains of a small oratory close to the Pilgrims' Way. In latter days a colony of monks from Newark settled at Chilworth, where the present manor house contains fragments of monastic building, and the fish ponds of the friars may still be seen near the terraced gardens. During the troubled times of the Wars of the Roses, the chapel of St. Martha fell into ruins, and owed its restoration to Bishop William of Waynfleet, who in 1463 granted 40 days' indulgence to all pilgrims who should visit the shrine and there repeat a Paternoster, an Ave, and a Credo, or contribute to its repair. After the dissolution of the monasteries, both Newark Priory and St. Martha's Shrine fell into ruins, and the chapel was only restored of late years. At Chilworth, south of St. Martha's Hill, lies the once fair valley which has been defaced by the powder mills, first established there 3 centuries ago by an ancestor of John Evelyn, and now worked by steam. This is the place which Cobbett denounces in his Rural Rides with a vigour and eloquence worthy of Mr. Ruskin himself. This valley, which seems to have been created by a bountiful providence as one of the choicest retreats of man, which seems formed for a scene of innocence and happiness, has been by ungrateful man so perverted as to make it instrumental in effecting two of the most damnable of purposes, in carrying into execution two of the most damnable inventions that ever sprang from the mind of man under the influence of the devil, namely, the making of gunpowder and of banknotes. Here, in this tranquil spot, where the nightingales are to be heard earlier and later in the year than in any other part of England, where the first budding of the buds is seen in spring, where no rigour of season can ever be felt, where everything seems formed for precluding the very thought of wickedness, here has the devil fixed on as one of the seats of this grand manufactory, and perverse and ungrateful man not only lends his aid, but lends it cheerfully. To think that the springs which God has commanded to flow from the sides of these happy hills for the comfort and delight of man, to think that these springs should be perverted into means of spreading misery over a whole nation. One of these inventions of the devil has been removed. The paper mills which made the banknotes in Cobbett's time are silent now, but the powder mills are in full activity, and Chilworth, with its coal stores and railway crossing, has a blackened and desolate look, which not all the natural beauties of its surroundings can dispel. Once more upon the hills, we can follow the line of yews which are seen at intervals along the ridge from St. Martha's Chapel by Weston Wood and the back of Albury Park, turning a few steps out of our path to visit Newlands Corner, the highest point of Albury Downs, and one of the most beautiful spots in the whole of Surrey. The view is as extensive as that from St. Martha's Hill, and is even more varied and picturesque. Over broken ridges of heathery down and gently swelling slopes, clad with beech and oak woods, we look across to Ewhurst Mill, a conspicuous landmark in all this country, and farther westward to the towers of Charterhouse and the distant heights of Hindhead and Blackdown, while immediately in front, across the wooded valley, rises St. Martha's Hill, crowned by its ancient chapel. Here we can watch the changes of sun and shower over the wide expanse of level country, and see the long range of far hills veiled in the thin blue mists of morning, or turning purple under the gold of the evening sky. Some of the oldest and finest yew trees in all Surrey are close to Newlands Corner. The ancient yew grove there is mentioned in Domesday, and their dark foliage offers a fine contrast to the bright tints of the neighbouring woods and to the snowy masses of blossom which in early summer clothe the gnarled old hawthorn trees that are studded over the hillside. We can follow the track over the springy turf of the open downs and up glades thick with bracken, till it becomes choked with bushes and brambles, and finally loses itself in the woods of Albury. Here, in the middle of the Duke of Northumberland's park, is the deep glen, surrounded by wooded heights, known as the Silent Pool. A dark tale, which Martin Tupper has made the subject of his Stephen Langton, belongs to this lonely spot. King John, tradition says, loved a fair woodsman's daughter who lived here, and surprised her in the act of bathing in the pool. The frightened girl let loose the branch by which she held, and was drowned in the water, and her brother, a goatherd, who at the sound of her scream had rushed in after her, shared the same fate. And still, the legend goes, at midnight you may see a black-haired maiden clasping her arms round her brother in his cowhide tunic under the clear, rippling surface of the Silent Pool. A little farther on is the old church of Albury, Elderbury, mentioned in Domesday, and supposed to be the most ancient in Surrey. The low tower, with its narrow two-light windows, probably dates back to very early Norman times, but the rest of the church is considerably later. The south chapel was richly decorated by Mr. Drummond, who bought the place in 1819, and is now used as a mortuary chapel for his family. Albury formerly belonged to the Dukes of Norfolk. The gardens were originally laid out by Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel, the accomplished collector of the Arundel marbles, and whose fine portrait by Van Dyck was exhibited at Burlington House in the winter of 1891. His friend and neighbour, Mr. Evelyn, helped him with his advice and taste, and designed the grotto under the hill, which still remains. Such a cowslip, remarks the author of The Silver, is nowhere in England besides. But the great ornament of Albury is the famous yew hedge, about 10 feet high and 1/4 of a mile long, probably the finest of its kind in England. So thick are the upper branches of the yew trees that, as William Cobbett writes, when he visited Albury in Mr. Drummond's time, they kept out both the rain and sun, and alike in summer and winter afford a most delightful walk. The grand terrace under the hill, 30 or 40 feet wide and 1/4 of a mile long, of the finest greensward, and as level as a die, particularly delighted him, and the careful way in which the fruit trees were protected from the wind, and the springs along the hillside collected to water the garden, gratified his practical mind. "Take it altogether," he goes on, "this certainly is the prettiest garden that I ever beheld. There was taste and sound judgment at every step in the laying out of this place. Everywhere utility and convenience is combined with beauty. The terrace is by far the finest thing of the sort that I ever saw, and the whole thing altogether is a great compliment to the taste of the times in which it was formed." The honest old reformer's satisfaction in these gardens was increased by the reflection that the owner was worthy of his estate, seeing that he was famed for his justice and kindness towards the labouring classes, who, God knows, have very few friends amongst the rich, and adds that he for one has no sympathy with the fools who want a revolution for the purpose of getting hold of other people's property. There are others who like pretty gardens as well as I, and if the question were to be decided according to the laws of the strongest, or, as the French call it, droit du plus fort, my chance would be but a very poor one. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Pilgrims Way, from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Pilgrims Way, from Winchester to Canterbury, by Julia Cartwright. Chapter 6, Shere to Reigate. The Pilgrims Way ran through Albury Park, passing close to the old church and under the famous yew hedge, and crossed the clear trout stream of the Tillingbourne by a ford still known as Chantry Ford. Here a noble avenue of lime trees brings us to Shere Church, a building as remarkable for the beauty of its situation as for its architectural interest. The lovely early English doorway, the heavy transitional arches of the nave, and the 14th century chancel are still unhurt, and among the fragments of old glass we recognise the flax breaker, which was the crest of the Brays, one of the oldest families in the county, who are, we rejoice to think, still represented here. Shere itself is one of the most charming villages in all this lovely neighbourhood. For many years now it has been a favourite resort of artistic and literary men, who find endless delight in the quiet beauty of the surrounding country. Subjects for pen and pencil abound in all directions: quaint old timbered houses, picturesque water-mills and barns, deep ferny lanes shaded by overhanging trees, and exquisite glimpses of heather-clad downs meet us at every turn. Fair as the scene is, travellers are seldom seen in these hilly regions, and so complete is the stillness, so pure the mountain air, that we might almost fancy ourselves in the heart of the Highlands instead of 30 miles from town. Here it was, in the midst of the wild scenery of these Surrey hills, that a sudden end closed the life of a great prelate of our own days, Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Winchester. A granite cross at Evershed's Rough, just below Lord Farrar's house at Abinger Hall, now marks the spot where his horse stumbled and fell as he rode down the hill towards Holmbury on that summer afternoon. About a mile beyond Abinger, we reach the home of John Evelyn and see the grey tower of the church where he is buried. This is Wootton, the town of the woods, as he loved to call it, sweetly environed with venerable woods and delicious streams. Wootton, where, after all his wanderings and all the turmoil of those troublous times, Evelyn found a peaceful haven wherein to end his days. There are the terraces, the fountains and groves in which he took delight. There, too, are the pine woods which he planted, not only for ornament, and because they create a perpetual spring, but because he held the air to be improved by their odoriferous and balsamical emissions. Not only these trees, but the oak and ash, and all the different species which he studied so closely and has written about so well, were dear to him as his own children, and he speaks in pathetic language of the violent storm which blew down 2,000 of his finest trees in a single night, and almost within sight of his dwelling, and left Wootton, now no more Woodton, stripped and naked, and almost ashamed to own its name. Methinks that I still hear, and I am sure that I feel, the dismal groan of our forests when that late dreadful hurricane, happening on the 26th of November 1703, subverted so many thousands of goodly oaks, prostrating the trees, laying them in ghastly postures, like whole regiments fallen in battle by the sword of the conqueror, and crushing all that grew beneath them. Evelyn's descendants have bestowed the same care on the woods and plantations, and in spite of the havoc wrought by wind and tempest, Wootton is still remarkable for the beauty of its forest trees and masses of flowering rhododendrons. The red brick house has been a good deal altered during the present century, but is still full of memorials of Evelyn. His portrait, and that of his wife and father-in-law, Sir Richard Browne, are there, and that of his angelic friend, Mistress Blagg, the wife of Godolphin, whose beautiful memory he has enshrined in the pages of the little volume that bears her name. The drawings which he made on his foreign travels are there too, and, better still, the books in which he took such pride and pleasure, carefully bound, bearing on their backs a device and motto which he chose, a spray of oak, palm, and olive entwined together, with the words Omnia explorate, meliora retinete. But the most precious relic of all is the prayer book used by Charles I on the morning of his execution. It was saved from destruction by a devoted loyalist, Isaac Herold, brother of a Walloon minister in London, and afterwards given by him to Evelyn's father-in-law, Sir Richard Browne. The fly-leaf bears a Latin inscription with this note: "This is the book which Charles I, Martyr Beatus, did use upon the scaffold, 30th of January 1649, being the day of his glorious martyrdom." The exact course of the Pilgrims Way here is uncertain. After leaving Shere Church it disappears, and we must climb a steep lane past Gomshall Station to find the track again on Hackhurst Downs. The line of yews is to be seen at intervals all along these downs, and as we descend into the valley of the Mole, opposite the heights of Box Hill, we pass 4 venerable yew trees standing in a field by themselves. One of the group was struck by lightning many years ago, but still stretches its gaunt, withered arms against the sky, like some weather-beaten signpost marking the way to Canterbury. The town of Dorking lies in the break here made in the chalk hills by the passage of the river Mole. Milton's "sullen mole that windeth underground," or, as Spenser sings in his Faerie Queen, mole that like a mouseling mole doth make his way still underground, till Thames he overtake. The mole owes its fame to the fact that it is so seldom seen, and several of the swallows or gullies into which it disappears at intervals along its chalky bed are at Burford, close to Dorking. The ponds which supplied the perch for that water souci which Dutch merchants came to eat at Dorking are still to be seen in the fields under Red Hill, and near them many an old timbered house and mill wheel well worth painting. Today Dorking is a quiet, sleepy little place, but its situation on the Stane Street, the great Roman road from Chichester to London, formerly made it a centre of considerable importance, and the size and excellence of the old-fashioned inns still bear witness to its departed grandeur. Whether, as seems most probable, the old road ran under the wall of Denby's Park and across the gap now made by the Dorking lime works, or whether, as the Ordnance map indicates, it crossed the breezy heights of Ranmore Common, pilgrims to Canterbury certainly crossed the mole at Burford Bridge about half a mile from the town. The remains of an ancient shrine known as the Pilgrims' Chapel are still shown in West Humble Lane. The path itself bears the name of Paternoster Lane, and the fields on either side are called the Pray Meadows. From this point the path runs along under Box Hill, the steep down that rises abruptly on the eastern side of Dorking, and takes its name from the box trees which here spring up so plentifully in the smooth green turf above the chalk. Box Hill is, we all know, one of the chief attractions which Dorking offers to Londoners. The other is to be found in the fine parks of Deepdene and Betchworth, immediately adjoining the town. The famous gardens and art collections of Deepdene, and the noble lime avenue of Betchworth, which now forms part of the same estate, have often been visited and described. The house at Deepdene is now closed to the public, but the traveller can still stroll under the grand old trees on the river bank, and enjoy a wealthy variety of forest scenery almost unrivalled in England. A picturesque bridge over the mole leads back to the downs on the opposite side of the valley, where the old track pursues its way along the lower slope of the hills, often wending its course through ploughed fields and tangled thickets, and disappearing altogether in places where chalk quarries and lime works have cut away the face of the down. But on the whole, the line of yews which mark the road is more regular between Dorking and Reigate than in its earlier course, and at Buckland, a village 2 miles west of Reigate, a whole procession of these trees descends into the valley. All this part of the road is rich in Roman remains. Of these, one of the most interesting was the building discovered in 1875 at Colley Farm, in the parish of Reigate, just south of the Way. Not only were several cinerary urns and fragments of Roman pottery dug up, but the walls of a Roman building were found under those of the present farmhouse. Some 20 years ago, a similar building was discovered at Abinger, also in the immediate vicinity of the track, but unfortunately it was completely destroyed in the absence of the owner, Sir Thomas Farrer. Another Roman house came to light in 1813 at Bletchlingley, and one chamber, which appears to be a hypocaust, was excavated at the time. Lastly, considerable Roman remains have been discovered and carefully excavated by Mr. Leveson Gower in the park at Titsey. Of these, the most important are a Roman villa, which was thoroughly excavated in 1864, together with a group of larger buildings, apparently the farm belonging to the ancient house. These are only a few of the principal links in the chain of Roman buildings which lie along the course of this ancient trackway, and which all help to prove its importance as a thoroughfare at the time of the Roman occupation. Another point of interest regarding this part of the Pilgrims Way is its connection with John Bunyan. when his peculiar opinions and open-air preachings had brought him into trouble with the authorities, he came to hide in these Surrey hills and earned his living for some time as a travelling tinker. 2 houses, one at Hornhatch on Shalford Common, the other at Quarry Hill in Guildford, are still pointed out as having been inhabited by him at this time, and a recent writer has suggested that in all probability the recollections of pilgrimage days, then fresh in the minds of the people, first gave him the idea of his Pilgrim's Progress. Certainly more than one incident in the history of the road bears a close resemblance to the tale of Christian's adventures. Thus, for instance, the swampy marshes at Shalford may have been the Slough of Despond. The blue Surrey hills, seen from the distance, may well have seemed to him the Delectable Mountains, and the name of Doubting Castle actually exists at a point of the road near Box Hill. Lastly, the great fair at Shalford corresponds exactly with Bunyan's description of Vanity Fair, no newly erected business, but a thing of ancient standing, where the ware of Rome and her merchandise is greatly promoted. Only our English nation have taken a dislike thereat. In the days when Bunyan wrote, the annual fair had degenerated into a lawless and noisy assembly, where little trade was done and much drinking and fighting and rude horseplay went on, as he may have found to his cost. The wares of Rome, in fact, were commodities no longer in fashion, and soon the fair itself came to an end and passed away, like so many other things that had been called into being by the Canterbury pilgrimage. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of the Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury by Julia Cartwright. Chapter 7. Reigate to Chevening. Although the town of Reigate lies in the valley, it certainly takes its name from the Pilgrims' Road to Canterbury. In Domesday it is called Shere, and it is not till the latter part of the 12th century that the comparatively modern name of Ridgegate, the Ridge Road, was applied, first of all to the upper part of the parish, and eventually to the whole town. In those days, a chapel dedicated to the memory of the blessed martyr, St. Thomas, stood at the east end of the long street, on a site now occupied by a market house, built early in the last century, and part of the ancient foundations of this pilgrimage shrine were brought to light when the adjoining prison was enlarged some 80 or 90 years back. Another chapel, dedicated to St. Lawrence the Martyr, stood farther down the street, and a third, the Chapel of Holy Cross, belonged to the Augustin canons of the priory founded by William of Warenne, Earl of Surrey, in the 13th century. In Saxon days, Reigate, or Holm Castle as it was then termed, from its situation at the head of the valley of Holmesdale, was an important stronghold, and the vigour and persistence with which the incursions of the Danes were repelled by the inhabitants of this district gave rise to the rhyme quoted by Camden: "The Vale of Holmesdale never won, ne never shall." At the Conquest, the manor was granted to William of Warenne, and from that time the castle became the most powerful fortress of the mighty Earls of Surrey. In the days of John, it shared the fate of Guildford Castle, and was one of the strongholds which opened its gates to Louis VIII, King of France, on his march from the Kentish coast to Winchester. The FitzAlans succeeded the Warennes in the possession of Reigate, and in the reign of Edward VI, both the castle and the priory were granted to the Howards of Effingham. Queen Elizabeth's Lord High Admiral, the victor of the Invincible Armada, lies buried in the vault under the chancel of Reigate Church. In Stuart times the castle gradually fell into decay until it was finally destroyed by order of Parliament during the Civil War, lest it should fall into the King's hands. Now only the mound of the ancient keep remains, and some spacious subterranean chambers which may have served as cellars or dungeons in Norman times. The priory has also been replaced by a modern house, and is the property of Lady Henry Somerset, the representative of the Earl Somers, to whom William III granted Reigate in 1697. Reigate is frequently mentioned in Cobbett's Rural Rides, and it was the sight of the priory that set him moralising over monasteries and asking himself if, instead of being, as we take it for granted, bad things, they were not, after all, better than poor rates, and if the monks and nuns who fed the poor were not more to be commended than the rich pensioners of the state, who feed upon the poor. Close to this ancient foundation is the hilly common known as Reigate Park, a favourite haunt with artists, who find endless subjects in the fern-grown dells and romantic hollows, the clumps of thorn trees with their gnarled stems and spreading boughs, their wealth of wild flowers and berries. The views over Reigate itself and the priory grounds on one side, and over the Sussex Weald on the other, are very charming, but a still finer prospect awaits us on the North Downs, on the opposite side of the valley, where the Pilgrims Road goes on its course. The best way is to climb Reigate Hill as far as the Suspension Bridge, and follow a path cut in the chalk to the summit of the ridge. It leads through a beech wood on to the open downs, where, if the day is clear, one of the finest views in the whole of England, in the whole world, says Cobbett, breaks upon us. The Weald of Surrey and of Sussex, from the borders of Hampshire to the ridge of East Grinstead and Crowborough Beacon, near Tunbridge Wells, lies spread out at our feet. Eastward, the eye ranges over the Weald of Kent and the heights above Sevenoaks. Westward, the purple ridge of Leith Hill and the familiar crest of Hindhead meet us, and far away to the south are the Brighton Downs and Chanctonbury Ring. The line of yew trees appears again here, and after keeping along the top of the ridge for about a mile, the Pilgrims Way enters Gatton Park, and passing through the woods near Lord Oxenbridge's house, joins the avenue that leads to Merstham. Gatton itself, which, like Reigate, takes its name from the Pilgrims' Road, Saxon, Gateton, the town of the road, was chiefly famous for the electoral privileges which it so long enjoyed. From the time of Henry VI until the Reform Bill of 1832, this very small borough returned 2 members to Parliament. In the reign of Henry VIII, Sir Roger Copley is described as the burgess and sole inhabitant of the borough and town of Gatton, and for many years the constituency consisted of one person, the lord of the manor. At the beginning of the present century there were only 8 houses in the whole parish, a fact which naturally roused the ire of William Cobbett. "Before you descend the hill to go into Reigate," he writes in one of his rural rides, "you pass Gatton, which is a very rascally spot of earth." And when rainy weather detained him a whole day at Reigate, he moralises in this vein: "In one rotten borough, one the most rotten too, and with another still more rotten up upon the hill, in Reigate and close by Gatton, how can I help reflecting, how can my mind be otherwise than filled with reflections on the marvellous deeds of the collective wisdom of the nation?" These privileges double the value of the property, and when Lord Monson bought Gatton Park in 1830, he paid £100,000 for the place. But the days of close boroughs were already numbered, and less than 2 years afterwards the Reform Bill deprived Gatton of both its members. The little town hall of Gatton, where the important ceremony of electing 2 representatives to serve in Parliament was performed, is still standing, an interesting relic of bygone days, on a mound in the park, almost hidden by large chestnut trees. Gatton House is chiefly remarkable for the marble hall built by the same Lord Monson in imitation of the Orsini Chapel at Rome, and adorned with rich marbles which he had brought from Italy. The collection of pictures, formed by the same nobleman, contains several good Dutch and Italian pictures, including the Vierge au bas relief, a graceful Holy Family, which takes its name from a small carved tablet in the background. It was long held to be an early work by the great Leonardo da Vinci, and was purchased by Lord Monson of Mr. Woodburn for £4,000, but is now generally attributed to his pupil, Cesare da Sesto. Like so many of the churches we have already mentioned, like Seal and Wanborough, and the chapels of St. Catherine and St. Martha, like the old church at Titsey and the present one at Chevening, Gatton was originally a pilgrim's church. Now it has little that is old to show, for it was restored by Lord Monson in 1831 and adorned with a variety of treasures from all parts of the continent. The stained glass comes from the monastery at Airshot, near Louvain, the altar rails from Tangres, the finely carved choir stalls and canopies from Ghent, and the altar and pulpit from Nuremberg. Like most of the medieval woodwork and glass which has come to England from that quaint old town of toil and traffic, quaint old town of art and song, these last are said to have been designed by the great master of the Franconian city, Albert Dürer. The Pilgrims Way, as has already been said, runs through Gatton Park and brings us out close to Merstham, and through lanes shaded with fine oaks and beeches we reach the pretty little village, with its old timbered cottages and still older church buried in the wood. Local writers of the last century frequently allude to the Pilgrim's Road as passing through this parish, although its exact course is not easy to trace. It seems, however, certain that the track passed near Lord Hilton's house and south of the church, which stands close by. In medieval times, Merstham formed part of the vast estates held by the monks of Christ Church, Canterbury, and was bestowed upon them by Athelstan, a son of Ethelred the Unready, in the 10th century. There was a church here at the time of the Norman conquest, but the only portion of the present building dating from that period is a fine old square Norman font, which, like several others in the neighbourhood, is of Sussex marble. Of later date there is much that is extremely interesting. The tower and the west door are early English, and the chancel arch is adorned with curious acanthus leaf mouldings, while the porch and chancel are late Perpendicular. After passing Merstham Church, the track is lost in a medley of roads and railway cuttings, but soon the line of yews appears again, climbing the crest of the hill, and can be followed for some distance along White Hill, or Quarry Hangers, as these downs are commonly called. The next object of interest which it passes is the War Camp, or Cardinal's Cap, as it is sometimes termed, an old British earthwork on the face of the chalk escarpment. Then the path turns into a wood, and we leave it to descend on Godstone. This is a fascinating spot for artists. The low, irregular houses are grouped round a spacious green and goose pond, shaded by fine horse chestnuts, and there is a charming inn, the White Hart, or Clayton Arms, with gabled front and large bay windows of the good old-fashioned type. "A beautiful village," wrote Cobbett 90 years ago, "chiefly of one street, with a fine large green before it, and with a pond in the green." And he goes on to speak of the neatness of the gardens, and of the double violets, as large as small pinks, which grew in the garden of this same inn, and of which the landlady was good enough to give some roots. Happily for his peace of mind, he adds, the vile, rotten borough of Bletchlingley, which lies under the downs close by, is out of sight. From Godstone it is a pleasant walk over the open commons along the top of the ridge, looking over the Weald of Sussex and across the valleys of Sevenoaks and Tunbridge to the Kentish hills. Once more we track the line of the Pilgrims Way as it emerges from the woods above the Godstone quarries and, passing under Winder's Hill and by Marden Park, reaches a wood called Palmer's Wood. The name is significant, more especially since there is no record of any owner who bore that name. Here its course is very clearly defined, and when, in the autumn of 1890, pipes for carrying water out of the hill were laid down, a section of the old paved road was cut across. A little farther on, at Limpsfield Lodge Farm, just on the edge of Titsey Park, it formed the farm road till 1875. At this point the path was 10 feet wide and the original hedges remained. Before entering the park of Titsey, the way runs through part of Oxted parish, where a spring still bears the name of St. Thomas's Well, and then reaches Titsey Place. Few places in this part of Surrey are more attractive than this old home of the Greshams. The purity of the air, praised by Aubrey long ago for its sweet, delicate, and wholesome virtues, the health-giving breezes of the surrounding downs and commons, the natural loveliness of the place, and the taste with which the park and gardens have been laid out, all help to make Titsey a most delightful spot. Its beautiful woods stretch along the grassy slopes of Botley Hill, and the clump of trees on the heights, known as Coldharbour Green, is 881 feet above the sea, and marks the loftiest point in the whole range of the North Downs. Wherever the eye rests, one ridge of wooded hill after the other seems to rise and melt away into the soft blue haze. Nor is there any lack of other attractions to invite the attention of scholar and antiquary. The place is full of historic associations. A whole wealth of antiquities, coins, urns, and pottery have been dug up in the park, and some remains of Roman buildings were discovered there a few years ago, close to the Pilgrims Way. After the Conquest, Titsey was given to the great Earls of Clare, who owned the property at the time of the Domesday Survey. In the 14th century it belonged to the Uvedale family, and 200 years later was sold to Sir John Gresham, an uncle of Sir Thomas Gresham, the illustrious merchant of Queen Elizabeth's court and the founder of the Royal Exchange. A fine portrait of Sir Thomas himself, by Antonio Moore, now hangs in the library of Titsey Place. Unfortunately, the Greshams suffered for their loyalty to Charles I, and after the death of the second Sir Marmaduke Gresham in 1742, a large part of the property was sold. His son, Sir John, succeeded in partly retrieving the fortunes of the family, and rebuilt and enlarged the old manor house, which had been allowed to fall into a ruinous state. But the Tudor arches of the east wing still remain, as well as much of the fine oak panelling which adorned its walls, and the crest of the Greshams, a grasshopper, may still be seen in the hall chimney-piece. The present owner, Mr. Leveson Gower, is a lineal descendant of the last baronet, and inherited Titsey from his great-grandmother Catherine, the heiress of the Greshams. The 14th century church was unluckily pulled down 100 years ago, because Sir John Gresham thought it stood too near his own house. But an old yew in the garden and some tombstones of early Norman date still mark its site. The course of the Pilgrims' Way through the park is clearly marked by a double row of fine ash trees, and the flint stones with which the road itself is paved may still be seen under the turf. Further along the road is a very old farmhouse, which was formerly a hostelry and still bears the name of the Pilgrims' Lodge. From Titsey the way runs along the side of the hills under Tatsfield Church, which stands on the summit of the ridge, and about a mile above the pretty little towns of Westerham and Brasted. Here the boundary of the counties is crossed, and the traveller enters Kent. Soon we reach the gates of Chevening Park, where, as at Titsey, the Pilgrims' Way formerly passed very near the house, until it was closed by Act of Parliament in 1780. The manor of Chevening, originally the property of the See of Canterbury, was held in the 13th and 14th centuries by the family of Chevening, from which it passed to the Leonards, who became Barons Dacre and Earls of Sussex. In the last century it was bought by General Stanhope, the distinguished soldier and statesman who, after reducing the island of Minorca, served King George I, successively as Secretary of State and First Lord of the Treasury. Inigo Jones built the house for Richard Leonard, Lord Dacre, early in the 17th century, but since then it has undergone such extensive alterations that little of the original structure remains, and the chief interest lies in a valuable collection of historical portraits, including those of the Chesterfields, Stanhopes, and the great Lord Chatham. The last named statesman, whose daughter Hester married Charles, Lord Stanhope, in 1774, was a frequent visitor at Chevening, and is said to have planned the beautiful drive which leads through the woods north of the house to the top of the downs. The little village of Chevening lies on the other side of the park, just outside Lord Stanhope's gates, and close to the old church of St. Botolph, which was one of the shrines frequented by the pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. There are some good early English arches in the nave and chancel, and a western tower of perpendicular date. The south chapel contains many imposing sepulchral monuments to the different lords of the manor. Amongst them are those of John Leonard, who was sheriff of the county, and held several offices under the crown in the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth, and of his son Sampson, who with his wife Margaret, Lady Dacre in her own right, reposes under a sumptuous canopy of alabaster, surrounded by kneeling effigies of their children. There is also a fine black marble monument to the memory of James, Earl of Stanhope, the Prime Minister of George I, who was buried here with great pomp in 1721. He was actually in office at the time of his death, and was taken ill in the House of Lords, and breathed his last the next day. But the most beautiful tomb here is Chantry's effigy of Lady Frederica Stanhope, sleeping with her babe in her arms, and an expression of deep content and peace upon her quiet face. Storms may rush in, and crimes and woes deform the quiet bower. They may not mar the deep repose of that immortal flower. End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of the Pilgrims' Way from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pilgrims' Way from Winchester to Canterbury by Julia Cartwright. Otford to Wrotham. We have followed the Pilgrims' Way over Hampshire downs and Surrey hills and commons, through the woods which Evelyn planted, along the ridge where Coburton rode. We have seen the track become overgrown with tangled shrubs and underwood, and disappear altogether in places. We have lost the road at one point in the fields, to find it again half a mile further. We have noted the regular lines of ewes climbing up the hillside, and the lonely survivors which are left standing bare and desolate in the middle of the cornfields. The part of the ancient road on which we are now entering differs in several important respects from its earlier course. From the time the Pilgrims Way enters Kent, its track is clearly marked. Already we have followed its line through Titsey, and along the downs as far as Chevening, where the path, now closed, may be traced through Lord Stanhope's Park. A group of magnificent old yew trees arrests our attention just beyond Chevening, before the road from Sevenoaks to Bromley is crossed. Then the way descends into the valley of the Darrant, an excellent trout stream which flows north through this chalk district to join the Thames near Dartford, and after crossing the ford over that river, regains the hills at Otford. From this place it runs along under the hill in one unbroken line all the way to Eastwell Park, between Ashford and Canterbury. It is a good bridle way, somewhat grass-grown in places, in others enclosed by hedges, and still used by farmers for their carts. Before toll bars were abolished, there was a good deal of traffic along this part of the Pilgrims Road, which, running as it does parallel with the turnpike road along the valley to Ashford, was much used as a means of evading the payment of toll. This cause is now removed, excepting for an occasional hunting man who makes use of the soft track along the hillside, or a camp of gypsies sitting round their fire. Wagoners and ploughmen are the only wayfarers to be met with along the Pilgrims Road, but the old name still clings to the track. As long as the squires of Kent have any respect for the traditions of the past, any particle of historic sense remaining, they will not allow the Pilgrims Way to be wiped out. In actual beauty of scenery, this portion of the way may not equal the former part. We miss the wild loveliness of Surrey Commons, the rare picturesqueness of the rolling downs around Guildford and Dorking. But this Kentish land has a charm of its own, which grows upon you the longer you know it. These steep slopes and wooded hollows, these grand old church towers and quaint village streets, these homesteads with their vast barns of massive timber and tall chimney stacks overshadowed with oaks and beeches, cannot fail to delight the eyes of all who find pleasure in rural scenes. And all along our way we have that noble prospect over the wide plains of the dim blue wild, which is seldom absent from our eyes, as we follow this narrow track up and down the rugged hillside. In historic interest and precious memorials of the past, this part of the Pilgrims Way, we need hardly say, is surpassingly rich. Endless are the great names and stirring events which these scenes recall. Battlefields where memorable fights were fought in days long ago. Churches and lands that were granted to the archbishops or abbots of Canterbury before the Conquest. Manor houses which our kings and queens have honoured with their presence in the days of yore. All these things and many more of equal interest and renown will the traveller find as he follows the Pilgrims Way along the chalk hills which form the backbone of Kent. The first resting place which the pilgrims would find on this part of their route would be the Archbishop's manor house at Otford. There were no less than 15 of these episcopal residences in different parts of Kent, Surrey and Sussex, and of these 3 lay along the Kentish portion of the Pilgrims Way. The palace at Otford possessed an especial sanctity in the eyes of wayfarers journeying to the shrine of St. Thomas, as having been a favourite residence of the martyred Archbishop himself. The manor was originally granted to the See of Canterbury in 791 by Offa, King of Mercia, who defeated Alderic, King of Kent, at Otford in 773, and conquered almost the whole province. More than 200 years later, Otford was the scene of another battle, in which Edmund Ironside defeated the Danes under Knut, and to this day bones are dug up in the meadow which bear the names of Danefield. From the 10th century the archbishops had a house here, and Otford is described in the Domesday Survey as Terra Arcipi Cantonensius. So it remained until Cranmer surrendered the palace, with many other of his possessions, to Henry VIII. The medieval archbishops seem to have had an especial affection for Otford, and spent much of their time at this pleasant country seat. Archbishop Winchelsea entertained Edward I in 1300, and was living here at the time of his death 13 years later, when his remains were borne by the King's command to Canterbury, and buried there with great state. Simon Islip enclosed the park, and Archbishop Dean repaired the walls, but the whole was rebuilt on a grander scale by Wrotham. He spent upwards of £30,000 upon the house, and received Henry VIII here several times in the first years of his reign. After Otford had become Crown property, the Archbishop's manor house passed into the hands of the Sidneys and Smiths, who dismantled the castle, as it was then commonly called, and allowed the walls to fall into ruin. Two massive octagonal towers of 3 stories, with double square-headed windows and a fragment of a cloister, now used as farm stables, are the only portions remaining. These evidently formed part of the outer court, and are good specimens of 15th century brickwork. The tower was considerably higher 100 years ago, and Hasted describes the ruins as covering nearly an acre of ground. The stones of the structure were largely used in the neighbouring buildings, and the Bull Inn contains a good deal of fine oak wainscoting, and several handsome carved mantelpieces, which originally belonged to the castle. 2 heads in profile, carved in oak over one of the fireplaces, are said to represent Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. A bath or chamber, paved and lined with stone about 30 feet long and 10 or 12 feet deep, not far from the ruins, still bears the name of Becket's Well. Tradition ascribes the birth of the spring which supplies it to St. Thomas, who, finding no water at Otford, struck the hillside of his staff, and at once brought forth a clear stream, which since then has never been known to fail. Another legend tells how the saint one day, being busy at his prayers in the garden at Otford, was much disturbed by the sweet noise and melody of a nightingale that sang in a bush beside him, and in the might of his holiness commanded all birds of this kind to be henceforth silent, after which the nightingale was never heard at Otford. But with the decay of the palace and the departure of the archbishops, the spell was broken, and a Protestant Lambard, when he was at Otford, takes pleasure in recording how many nightingales he heard singing thereabouts. From Otford, the Pilgrims Way runs along the edge of the hills, about half a mile above the villages of Kemsing and Wrotham, and passes close to St. Cleer, a mansion built by Inigo Jones, where Mrs. Boscawen, the witty correspondent of Mrs. Delaney, and a friend of Johnson and Boswell, was born. Kemsing still retains its old church and well, both consecrated to the memory of the Saxon princess St. Edith, whose image in the churchyard was, during centuries, the object of the peasants' devout veneration. "Some seely body," writes Lambard, who visited these shrines in Queen Elizabeth's reign, and delights in pouring contempt on the old traditions of these country shrines, brought a perch or 2, or a bushel of corn, to the church, after prayers made, offered it to the image of the saint. Of this offering the priest used to toll the greatest portion, and then to take 1 handful or little more of the residue, for you must consider he would be sure to gain by the bargain, the which, after aspiration of holy water, and the mumbling of a few words of conjuration, he first dedicated to the image of St. Edith, and then delivered it back to the party that brought it, who departed with full persuasion that if he mingled that hallowed handful with his seed corn, it would preserve from harm, and prosper in growth, the whole heap that he should sow, were it never so great a stake. Wrotham was the site of another of the Archbishop's manor houses, and rivalled Otford in antiquity, having been granted to the See of Canterbury by Athelstan in 964. Wrotham was never as favourite a residence with the Archbishops as Otford, but they stopped here frequently on their progresses through Kent, until in the 14th century Simon Islip pulled down the house to supply materials for the building of his new palace at Maidstone. A terrace and some scanty remains of the offices are the only fragments now to be seen at Wrotham, the charming situation of the village, in the midst of luxuriant woods, and the beauty of the view over the Weald from Wrotham Hill attract many visitors. The church has several features of architectural interest, including a handsome rood screen of the 14th century and a watching chamber over the chancel, as well as a curious archway under the tower, which was probably used as a passage for processions from the palace. It contains many tombs and brasses, chiefly of the Peckham family, who held the manor of Owlivia in this parish for upwards of 500 years. Below the church is Wrotham Place, a fine old Tudor house with a corridor and rooms of the 15th century, a charming garden front bearing the date 1560. Fairlawn, the ancestral home of the Vanes, also lies in a corner of Wrotham parish, and a terrace, bordered with close-clipped yew hedges and surrounded by sunny lawns, where peacocks spread their tails over the grass, is still pointed out as a favourite walk of that stout old regicide, Sir Henry Vane. Ixham, with its famous moat, so perfect a picture of an old English house, is close by, within a walk of Wrotham station, but lies, unluckily, on the opposite side from the line of hills along which our path takes us. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of the Pilgrims Way, from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pilgrims Way, from Winchester to Canterbury, by Julia Cartwright. Wrotham to Hollingbourne. The Pilgrims Way continues its course over Wrotham Hill and along the side of the Chalk Downs. This part of the track is a good bridle road, with low grass banks or else hedges on either side, and commands fine views over the rich Kentish plains, the broad valley of the Medway, and the hills on the opposite shore. The river itself glitters in the sun, but as we draw nearer, the beauty of the prospect is sorely marred by the ugly chimneys and dense smoke of the Snodland limestone works. At one point on the downs, close to the Thygo Inn, a few hundred yards above our road, there is a very extensive view over the valley of the Thames, ranging from Shooter's Hill to Gray's End, and far away out to sea. In the daytime, the masts of the shipping in the river are clearly seen. At night, the Nore lights twinkle like stars in the distance. The height of these downs is close on 700 feet. That of Knockholt is 783 feet. On the other side of the Medway, the chalk range is considerably lower, and the highest points are above Detling, 657 feet, Hollingbourne, 606 feet, and Charing, 640 feet. The way now runs past Pilgrim's House, formerly the Kentish Drovers' Inn, above the old church and village of Trosley, and the megalithic stones known as Cauldron's Circle, one of the best preserved cromlechs along the road. Further on, a short lane leads south to Burling Place, the ancient home of the Nevilles, who have owned the estate since the middle of the 15th century, while in a group of old farm buildings at Paddlesworth, formerly Paulsford, we find the remains of a Norman pilgrim's chapel, with fine early English arch. The track now crosses a large field, and enters Snodland, an old town containing many Roman remains, and an interesting church, but sadly disfigured by cement works and paper factories. Here the pilgrims left the hills to descend into the valley below. Twice before at Shalford and Dorking, they had crossed the rivers which make their way through the chalk range. Now they had reached the third great break in the downs, and a broad stream of the Medway lay at their feet. They might, if they pleased, go on to Rochester, 3 miles higher up, and join the road taken by the London pilgrims along the Watling Street to Canterbury, the route of Chaucer's pilgrimage. But most of them, it appears, preferred to follow the hills to which they had clung so long. The exact place where they had crossed the river has often been disputed. According to the old maps, it was by the ford at Cuxton, where the river was shallow enough to allow of their passage. From Bunker's Farm, immediately above Burling, a road diverges northwards to Cuxton and Rochester, and was certainly used by many of the pilgrims. At Upper Halling on this track, we may still see the lancet windows of a pilgrim's shrine, formerly dedicated to St. Lawrence, which had been built into some cottages known as chapel houses. The bishops of Rochester, who held this manor from Egbert's days, had a right fair house at Lower Halling, on the banks of the Medway, with a vineyard which produced grapes for King Henry III's table. This pleasant manor house on the river was the favourite summer residence of Bishop Hameau de Hef, who built a new hall and chapel in the reign of Edward I, and placed his own statue on a gateway which was still standing in the 18th century. Another interesting house, Warne Place, lies a little higher up on the banks of the Medway, where the grass-grown track leading from Bunker's Farm joins the main road to Cuxton and Rochester. This fine brick mansion formerly belonged to the Levisons, and the quarterings of Sir John Levison and his 2 wives are to be seen above the central porch. In the 13th century, a great number of pilgrims seem to have stopped at Maidstone, where in 1261 Archbishop Boniface built a hospital for their reception on the banks of the Medway. The funds which supported this hospital, the New Work, nor the Operas as it was called, were diverted by Archbishop Courtenay 140 years later to the maintenance of his new College of All Saints on the opposite side of the river. The remnant of the older foundation is still preserved in the beautiful early English chancel of St. Peter's Church, which was originally attached to Boniface's hospital and is still known as the Pilgrims' Chapel. By the time that Archbishop Courtenay founded his college, the stream of pilgrims had greatly diminished, and the hostel which had been intended for their resting place was rapidly shrinking into a common almshouse. Maidstone, too, no doubt, lay considerably out of the pilgrims' course, and a great majority naturally preferred to cross the Medway by the ferry at Snodland. Others again might choose Aylesford, which lay a mile or 2 below. At this ancient town, the Egglesford of the Saxon Chronicle, there was a stone bridge across the river, and a Carmelite priory founded in 1240 by Richard de Grey on his return from the Crusades, where the pilgrims would be sure to find shelter. But even if they did not cross the Medway at this place, where the old church stands, so picturesquely on its high bank overhanging river and red roofs, the pilgrims certainly passed through the parish of Aylesford. For on the opposite banks of the ferry at Snodland, the familiar line of yew trees appears again, ascending the hill by Burcombe Church, and runs for the upper part of Aylesford parish, close to the famous dolmen of Kit's Cotty House. This most interesting sepulchral monument, Ced Colt, Celtic for the tomb in the wood, consists of 3 upright blocks of sandstone about 8 feet high and 8 feet broad, with a covering stone of 11 feet, which forms the Ruth, and is one of a group of similar remains which lie scattered over the hillside, and are locally known as the Countless Stones. We have here in fact the great cemetery of the Druids, which once extended for many miles on both sides of the river. Deep pits dug out in the chalk, filled with flints and covered with slabs of stone, have been discovered on Aylesford Common, and a whole avenue of stones formerly connected this burial place with the cromlechs at Addington, 6 miles off. Here, if the old legend be true, was fought the great battle which decided the fate of Britain and gave England into the hands of the English. For at this place the old chroniclers say, about the year 455, the Saxon invaders stopped on their march to the castle of Rochester, and turning southwards met the Britons in that deadly fray, when both Kentigern and Horsa were left dead on the field of battle. Ancient military entrenchments are still visible on the hillside near Kit's Cotty House, and a boulder on the top was long pointed out as the stone on which Hengest was proclaimed the first king of Kent. About a mile from this memorable spot, in the plains at the foot of the Downs, was a shrine which no pilgrim of medieval days would leave unvisited, the Cistercian Abbey of Boxley, then generally known as the Abbatier St. Crucis de Graces, the Abbey of the Holy Rood of Grace. Not only was Boxley, next to Waverley Abbey, the oldest Cistercian house founded on this side of the Channel, the filial proprietor of the great house of Clairvaux, but the convent church rejoiced in the possession of two of the most celebrated wonder-working relics in all England. There was the image of St. Rumbold, that infant child of a Saxon prince, who reclaimed himself a Christian the moment of his birth, and after 3 days spent in edifying his pagan hearers, departed this life. This image could only be lifted by the pure and good, and having a hidden spring which could be worked by the hands or feet of the monks, was chiefly influenced by the amount of the coin that was paid into their hands. And there was that still greater marvel, the miraculous rood, or winking image, a wooden crucifix which rolled its eyes and moved its lips in response to the devotees who crowded from all parts of England to see the wondrous sight. The clever mechanism of this image, said to have been invented by an English prisoner during his captivity in France, was exposed by Henry VIII's commissioners in 1538, who discovered certain engrins of old wire, with old rotten sticks in the back of the same, and showed them to the people of Maidstone on market day, after which the Rood of Grace was taken to London, and solemnly broken in pieces at Paul's Cross. The Abbey of Boxley owned vast lands, and the abbots were frequently summoned to Parliament, and lived in great state. Among the royal guests whom they entertained was King Edward II, whose visit was made memorable by the letter which he addressed from Boxley Abbey to the aldermen of the City of London, granting them the right of electing a Lord Mayor. At one time their extravagance brought them to the verge of ruin, as we learn from a letter which Archbishop Warham addressed to Cardinal Wolsey. But at the dissolution the commissioners could find no cause of complaint against the monks, excepting the profusion of flowers in the convent garden, which made them comment on the waste of turning the rents of the monastery into gilliflowers and roses. The foundations of the church, where the Cistercians showed off their psalteries, may still be traced in the gardens of the house built by Sir Thomas Wyatt on the site of the abbey. Here some precious fragments of the ruins are still preserved. The chapel of St. Andrew, which stood near the great gateway, has been turned into cottages, and the noble Guston House, where strangers were lodged, is now a barn. The old wall remains to show the once vast extent of the abbey precincts. Now these grey stones are mantled with thick bushes of ivy, and a fine clump of elm trees overshadows the red-tiled roof of the ancient guest-house in the meadows. But we look in vain for poor Abbot John's gilliflowers and roses. Between Boxley Abbey and Maidstone stretches the wide common of Pennenden Heath, famous from time immemorial as the place where all great county meetings were held. Here the Saxons held their Gemotes, and here in 1076 was that memorable assembly before which Lanfranc pleaded the cause of the Church of Canterbury against Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, Earl of Kent, the Conqueror's half-brother, who had defrauded Christ Church of her rights, and laid violent hands on many of her manors and lands. Not only were the Kentish nobles and bishops summoned to try the cause, but barons and distinguished ecclesiastics, and many men of great and good account, from all parts of England and Normandy, were present that day. Godfrey, Bishop of Coutances, represented the king, and Agelric, the aged Bishop of Chester, an ancient man well versed in the laws and customs of the realm, was brought there in a chariot by the king's express command. 3 days the trial lasted, during which Lanfranc pleaded his cause so well against rapacious Norman that the See of Canterbury recovered its former possessions, and saw its liberties firmly established. The village and church of Boxley, Boslew in Doomsday, so called from the box trees that grow freely along the downs, as at Box Hill, are about 1.5 miles beyond the abbey, and lie under sloping ground at the foot of the hills, close to the Pilgrims Way. Old houses and timbered barns with lofty gables and irregular roofs are grouped round the church, which is itself as picturesque an object as any, with its massive towers and curious old red-tiled Galilee porch. Next we reach Detling, a small village, prettily situated on the slope of the hills, with a church containing a rare specimen of medieval woodwork in the shape of a carved oak reading desk, enriched with pierced tracery of the decorated period. We pass Thurnham, with the foundations of its Saxon castle high up on the downs, and then enter Hollingbourne, as Box reminds us of the box trees on the hillside, and Thurnham of the thorn trees in the wood. So Hollingbourne owes its name to the hollies on the burn or stream which runs through the parish. William Cobbett, whose memory has followed us all the way from the Itchen Valley, describes how he rode over Hollingbourne Hill on his return from Dover to the Wen, and from the summit of that down, one of the highest in this neighbourhood, looked down over the fair Kentish land, which in its richness and beauty seemed to him another garden of Eden. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of The Pilgrims Way, from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. The Pilgrims Way, from Winchester to Canterbury, by Julia Cartwright. Chapter 10. Hollingbourne to Lenham. The village of Hollingbourne lies at the foot of the hill, and an old inn at the corner of the Pilgrims Road, now called the King's Head, was formerly known by the name of the Pilgrims' Rest. The history of Hollingbourne is full of interest. The manor was granted to the church at Canterbury for the support of the monks by young Athelstan, the son of Ethelred II, in the year 980, and was retained by the monastery when Lanfranc divided the lands belonging to Christchurch between the priory and the see. It is described in Domesday as Terra Moncorum Archipi, the land of the monk and the archbishop. In later records, as Manorium Monachorum Edicibo Eorum, a manor of the monks and for their food. The priors of Christchurch held their courts here, and the convent records tell us that Prior William Selling greatly improved the priory rooms at Hollingbourne. Their residence probably occupied the site of the present manor house. This handsome red brick building, rich in gables and mullions, in oak panelling and secret hiding places, was built in Queen Elizabeth's reign by the great Kentish family of the Culpepers, who at that time owned most of the parish. More than one fragment of the earlier house, encased in the Elizabethan building, has been brought to light, and a pointed stone archway of the 13th century and an old fireplace with herringbone brickwork have lately been discovered. Many are the interesting traditions which belong to this delightful old manor house. The yews in the garden are said to have been planted by Queen Elizabeth on one of her royal progresses through Kent, when she stayed at Leeds Castle and was the guest of Sir Henry Wotton at Bourton Malherbe. According to another very old local tradition, Catherine Howard, whose mother was a Culpepper, spent some years here as a girl, and the ghost of that unhappy queen is said to haunt one of the upper chambers of the house. Another room, called the Needle Room, was occupied during the Commonwealth by the daughters of that faithful loyalist, John Lord Culpepper, Frances, Judith, and Philippa, who employed the weary years of their father's exile in embroidering a gorgeous altar cloth and hangings, which they presented to the parish church on the happy day when the king came back to enjoy his own again. The tapestries, worked by the same deft fingers which once adorned the chambers of the manor house, are gone, and the hangings of the reading desk in the church have been cut up into a frontal, but the altar cloth remains absolutely intact and is one of the finest pieces of embroidery of the kind in England. Both design and colouring are of the highest beauty. On a ground of violet velvet, bordered with a frieze of cherub heads, we see the 12 mystic fruits of the tree of life, the grape, orange, cherry, apple, plum, pear, mulberry, acorn, peach, medlar, quince, and pomegranate. The richest hues of rose and green are delicately blended together, and their effect is heightened by the gold thread in which the shading is worked. The lapse of 2 centuries and a half has not dimmed the brightness of their colours, which are as fresh as if the work had been finished yesterday. A needle, which had been left in a corner of the altar cloth all those long years ago, was still to be seen sticking in the velvet early in the last century, but has now disappeared. This goodly manor house was only one of several seats belonging to the Culpepers in this neighbourhood. They had a mansion at Greenway Court, which was burnt down in the last century, and another of imposing dimensions where Grove Court now stands. In the 17th century, the Lords Culpeper also owned Leeds Castle, that noble moated house, a mile to the south, which was once a royal park and is still one of the finest places in Kent. But the second Lord Culpeper died without a male heir in 1688, and this famous house passed by marriage into the Fairfax family. The Hollingbourne branch of the Culpepers died out in the course of the last century, and at the present time no member of this illustrious family is known to exist in England, although persons bearing this ancient name are still to be found in America. The church at Hollingbourne contains a whole series of Culpeper monuments. The most remarkable is the white marble altar tomb, which bears the recumbent effigy of Elizabeth Lady Culpeper, who died in 1638, and is described in the inscription on her monument as Optima Femina, Optima Conjux, et Optima Martyr. This lady was the heiress of the Cheney family, whose arms, the ox's hide and horns, appear on the shield at the foot of the tomb, and are repeated in the stained glass of the chapel window. Tradition says that Sir John Cheney had his helmet struck off when he fought by the victor's side on Bosworth Field, and fixed a bull's horn on his head in its place. Afterwards Henry VII gave him this crest, when he made him a baron and a Knight of the Garter, in reward for his valour on that hard-fought field. A monument on the north wall of the chancel records the memory of John Lord Culpeper, who was successively Chancellor of the Exchequer, Master of the Rolls, and Privy Councillor to Charles I and Charles II. For equal fidelity to the king and kingdom, says the epitaph on his tomb, he was most exemplary. He followed the last named king into exile and remained there until the Restoration, when, with him, he returned triumphant into England on the 29th of May, 1660, only to die 6 weeks afterwards, to the irreparable loss of his family. Another descendant of the Culpepers is buried under the altar in this church, Dame Grace Gethin, a great-granddaughter of Sir Thomas Culpeper and wife of Sir Richard Gethin of Gethingrot in Ireland, whose learning and virtues were so renowned that monuments were erected in her honour both at Bath and in Westminster Abbey. This youthful prodigy, who died at the age of 21, is here represented kneeling between 2 angels, and holding in her hand the commonplace book which she filled with extracts from her favourite authors, and which was afterwards published under the title of Reliquiae Gethincianae. Her piety was as great as her personal charms, and the inscription on her monument records how, being adorned with all the graces and perfections of mind and body, crowned them all with exemplary patience and humility, and having the day before her death most devoutly received the Holy Communion, which she said she would not have omitted for 10,000 worlds, she was vouchsafed in a miraculous manner an immediate prospect of her future bliss, for the space of 2 hours, to the astonishment of all about her, and being like St. Paul, in an unexpressible transport of joy, thereby fully evincing her foresight of the heavenly glory, in unconceivable raptures, triumphing over death, and continuing sensible to the last, she resigned her pious soul to God, and victoriously entered into rest October the 11th, Anno Aetatis 21, Dini 1697. Her dear and affectionate mother, whom God in mercy supported by her seeing her glorious end, erected this monument, her being her last surviving issue. Soon after leaving Hollingbourne, the Pilgrims Way enters the ground of Steed Hill and passes through the beech woods that spread down the grassy slopes to the village and church of Harrietsham, Heriard's home in Doomsday, in the valley below. An altar tomb to the memory of Sir William Steed, who died in 1574, and several other monuments to members of the same family may be seen in the south chapel of the church, a fine building of early English and perpendicular work, with a good rood screen, standing in an open space at the foot of the Steed Hill grounds. The rectory of Harrietsham was formerly attached to the neighbouring priory of Leeds, but was granted by Henry VI to Archbishop Chichele's new-founded College of All Souls, Oxford, which still retains the patronage of this living. The manor was one of many in this neighbourhood given to Odo of Bayeux after the Battle of Hastings, and afterwards formed part of the vast estates owned by Juliana de Leybourne, called the Infanta of Kent, who was married 3 times but died without children, leaving her lands to become crown property. A mile farther, the Pilgrims Way enters the town of Lenham. This parish contains both the sources of the river Len, the Aqua Lena of the Romans, which flows through Harrietsham and by Leeds Castle into the Medway, and that of the Stour, which runs in the opposite direction towards Canterbury. Lenham has held a charter and enjoyed the privileges of a town from medieval times. The bright little market square, full of old houses with massive oak beams and quaint corners jutting out in all directions, hardly agrees with Hasted's description of Lenham as a dull, unfrequented place where nothing thrives in the barren soil, and the inhabitants, when asked by travellers if this is Lenham, invariably reply, "Ah, sir, poor Lenham." The picturesqueness of its buildings is undeniable, and its traditions are of the highest antiquity. The manor of Lenham was granted to the Abbey of St. Augustine at Canterbury by Cenulf, King of Mercia, more than 1,000 years ago, and in the 12th century the church was appropriated to the refectory of St. Augustine. That is to say, the rectorial tithes were made to supply the monks' dinner. Some fragments of the original Norman church still exist, but the greater part of the present structure, the arcade of bays, the fine traceried windows of the aisle, and most of the chancel, belong to the Decorated period, and were rebuilt after the Great Fire in 1297, when not only the church, but the abbot's barns and farm buildings were burnt to the ground by an incendiary. So great was the sensation produced by this act of wanton mischief, that Archbishop Winchelsea himself came to Lenham to see the ravages wrought by the fire, and fulminated a severe excommunication against the perpetrators of the wicked deed. The 16 oak stalls for the monks, and an arched stone sedilia of the 14th century, which served the abbot for his throne when he visited his Lenham estates, are still to be seen in the chancel. Here, too, is a sepulchral effigy let into the north wall in a curious sideways position, representing a priest in his robes, supposed to be that of Thomas de Apperfelder, who lived at Lenham in the reign of Edward II and died in 1327. Both the western tower and the north chancel, dedicated to St Edmund and containing tombs of successive lords of East Lenham Manor, are perpendicular in style and belong to the 14th or early part of the 15th century. Fragments of the 14th century paintings, with which the walls of the whole church were once adorned, may still be distinguished in places. Among them are the figures of a bishop, probably St Augustine, and of St Michael weighing souls, with devils trying to turn the balance in their favour on one side, and on the other the crowned Virgin throwing her rosary into the scale, which holds the souls of the just. The church was dedicated to St Mary the Virgin, and her image formerly occupied the niche in the timbered porch which, with the old lich gate, are such fine specimens of 15th century woodwork. The beautiful Jacobean pulpit was given by Anthony Honeywood in 1622, and is charmingly carved with festoons of grapes and vine leaves. The Honeywoods also built the almshouses, with carved barge boards and doorposts, in the street at Lenham, and an inscription in the chancel floor records the memory of that long-lived dame, Mary Honeywood, who before her death in 1620 saw no less than 367 of her descendants. Close to the church are the great tithe barns, built after the fire in the 14th century by the abbots of St Augustine. The largest measures 157 feet long by 40 feet wide, and, saving the low stone walls, is built entirely of oak from the forests of the Weald. The enormous timbers are as sound and strong today as they were 600 years ago, and for solidity of material and beauty of construction, this Kentish barn deserves to rank among the grandest architectural works of the age. The monks are gone, and the proud abbey itself has long been laid in ruins, but these buildings give us some idea of the wealth and resources of the great community who were the lords of Lenham during so many centuries. They could afford to lend a kindly ear to the prayer of the poor vicar when he humbly showed the poverty with which he had to contend, and the load of the burden that he had to bear. The abbot, we are glad to learn, granted his request, and agreed to give him a roof over his head, and to allow his 2 cows to feed with the monks' own herds in the pasture at Lenham during the months between the feast of St Philip and St James and Michaelmas. End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Owlivia. The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury by Julia Cartwright. Chapter 11. Charing to Godmersham. From Lenham, the Pilgrims' Road threads its lonely way along the hillside, past 1 or 2 decayed farmhouses, still bearing the name of the great families who once owned these manors, the Selves and the Cobhams. And the view over the level country grows wider and extends farther to the south and east until we reach Charing Hill, one of the highest points along this range of downs. The windmill, a few hundred yards above the track, commands a far-spreading view over the valley, stretching from the foot of the ridge to the Quarry Hills, where the towers of Edgerton Church stand out on its steep mound above the hazy plains of the Weald. We look down upon Cow Hill, the home of the Darrells for the last 5 centuries, and across the woods and park of Surrendon, Deering, which has been held by the Deering family ever since the days of Earl Godwin, to the churches and villages of the Weald. Beyond a foreground of swelling hill and dale, we see the flat expanse of Romney Marsh and Dungeness, and then, for the first time, we catch a glimpse of a pale blue line of sea, that sea across which Roman and Saxon and Norman all sailed in turn to land upon the Kentish shore. On clear days you can see the Sussex Downs in the far horizon beyond the Weald, and near Hastings the hill of Fairlight rising sharply from the sea. Down in the valley below, the tall tower of Charing Church lifts its head out of a confused mass of red roofs and green trees, with the ivy-grown ruins of the old palace at its feet. Many are the venerable traditions attached to the churches and villages which we have seen along our road through this pleasant land of Kent. But here is one older and more illustrious than them all. Here we have a record which goes back far beyond the days of Lanfranc and of Athelstan, and even that king of Mercia who gave Lenham to the Abbey of St. Augustine. For Charing, if not actually given, as the old legend says, by Vortigern to the ancient British Church, was at all events among the first lands bestowed upon Augustine and his companions by Ethelbert, King of Kent. Saxon historians tell us how that this most ancient possession of the Church of Canterbury was seized by Offa, King of Mercia, in 757, but restored again by his successor, Canulf, in the year 788. Long before the Conqueror's time, the archbishops had a house here. In Domesday Book, Charing is styled Proprium Manorium Archiepiscopi, being reserved by those prelates for their private use, and from those days until the manor was surrendered by Cranmer to Henry VIII, it remained a favorite residence of the archbishops. In the 13th century, the Franciscan Archbishop John Peckham dates many letters from his house at Charing, and Stratford, as Dean Hook tells us, was often there, and found consolation in this quiet retreat for the troubles of those stormy days. Chichilly, Camp, and Bourchier were also frequently here. Stratford first obtained the grant of 3 days' fair to be held at Charing twice a year on the festivals of St. George and St. Luke. Leland tells us that Cardinal Morton made great buildings at Charing, and the red and black brickwork still to be seen under the ivy of the farmhouse walls may be ascribed to him, but the great gateway with the chamber and hooded fireplace above belongs to an earlier period, and was probably the work of Stratford in the 14th century. Some of the older stonework is to be found in the stables and cottages now occupying the site of the offices on the west of the court. The chapel, with its pointed arches and large windows, which in Hasted's time stood behind the modern dwelling house, was taken down 80 years ago, but the great dining hall, with its massive walls and fine decorated window, still remains standing. This hall, where archbishops sat in state and kingly guests were feasted, where Henry VII was royally entertained by Archbishop Warham on the 24th of March, 1507, and where Henry VIII stayed with all his train on his way to the Field of Cloth of Gold, is now used as a barn. But in its decay, it must be owned, the old palace is singularly picturesque. The wallflowers grow in golden clusters high up the roofless gables and along the arches of the central gateway. Masses of apple blossom hang over the gray stone walls, and ringed-necked doves bask in the sunshine on the richly colored tiles of the old banqueting hall. Close by is the church of Charing, famous in the eyes of medieval pilgrims for the possession of one hallowed relic, the block on which St. John the Baptist was beheaded, brought back, an old tradition says, by Richard Coeur de Lion from the Holy Land, and given by him to Archbishop Baldwin when the king paid his devotions at the shrine of St. Thomas. This precious relic went the way of all relics in the 16th century, and is not mentioned in the long list of costly vestments and frontals recorded in an inventory of church property taken at Charing in 1552. But Charing Church is still, in the words of the old chronicler, a goodly pile. It is cruciform in shape, and contains some traces of early English work, but is mostly of later date. The windows are interesting on account of their great variety. There are 3 narrow lancets, several of transitional and perpendicular style, and one large and very remarkable square-headed decorated window. The chapel of Our Lady on the south side of the chancel was built toward the close of the 15th century by Amy Brent, whose family owned the charming manor house of Wickens in this parish. The porch and fine tower, which forms so marked a feature in the landscape, was also chiefly built by the Brents, whose crest, a wyvern, is carved on the doorway, together with a rose encircled with sun rays, the badge of Edward IV, in whose reign the work was completed. Through this handsome doorway the archbishop, attended by his cross-bearers and chaplains, would enter from the palace gate hard by, and many must have been the stately processions which passed under the western arch and wound up the long nave in the days of Morton and Warham. 100 years later, Charing Church narrowly escaped entire destruction. On the 4th of August, 1590, a farmer, one Mr. Dios, discharged a birding piece at a pigeon roosting, as the pigeons do to this day, in the church tower, and, quote, the day being extreme hot and the shingle very dry, end quote, a fire broke out in the night, and by morning nothing was left but the bare walls of the church, even the bells having melted by the heat of the fire. Happily, the parishioners applied themselves with patriotic zeal to the restoration, and within 2 years the fine timber roof of the nave was completed. The date, 1592, ER 34, is inscribed on the rafter above the chancel arch, while that of the chancel roof, Anno Domini 1622, Anno Regni Jacobi 18, appears on the beam immediately over the altar. The Pilgrims Way winds on through Charing, past the noble church tower and the ancient palace wall, with its thick clusters of ivy and trailing wreaths of traveller's joy, through the lovely woods of Pett Place, the home of the Honeywoods and Sayers for some hundreds of years. The track crosses the long avenue of stately limes which leads up to its gates, and through the meeting boughs we see the red gables and tall chimneys of the old Tudor house. In the 14th century, the owners of Pett had a chapel of their own, served by a priest whose name appears in the Lambeth Register and other records as holding the living at Pett juxta Charing, and Geoffrey de Newcourt, who owned this manor, together with the adjoining one of Newcourt, paid the king an aid on his lands of Pett when the Black Prince was knighted. A pleasant part of the track, this dear to botanists for the wealth of ferns, flowers, and rare orchises which grow along the shady path, pleasant alike in May, when cowslips and violets grow thick in the grass and the nightingales are in full song, and in June, when the ripe red fruit of the wild strawberries peep out from under the moss and the hawthorns are in bloom, but perhaps best of all in autumn, when the beeches are crimson and the maples in the hedges are one fire of gold. For the next 3 miles, the way lies through the lower part of the great woods of Long Beach, which stretch all over these hills, and which from very early times belonged to the See of Canterbury. It brings us out at Westwell, close to another extremely interesting church, dating from the middle of the 13th century, and almost entirely of one period. The graceful steeple, nave, chancel, and aisles are all early English, but the most striking feature is the high open colonnade which forms the rood screen. The effect of the chancel, with its side arcade, its groined roof, and beautiful lancet windows filled with richly colored old glass, seen through these lofty arches, is very imposing. There's another curious fragment of stained glass, bearing the arms of Queen Anne of Bohemia and of Edward the Confessor and his wife, in the north aisle, and the chancel contains 6 stone walls and a stone seat with a pointed arch, which were formerly used by the monks and prior of Christ Church, Canterbury. For the manor of Westwell, like so many others in this neighbourhood, belonged to the See of Canterbury before the Conquest, and the division of property effected by Lanfranc was retained by the priory. Its revenues were allotted to the supply of the monks' refectory, ad cibum eorum, just as the tithes of Lenham were used to provide meals for St. Augustine's Abbey. Half a mile above Westwell Church, the Pilgrims' Way reaches the gates of Eastwell. Here the track disappears for a time, but old maps show the line which it took across the southern slopes of the park, which extends for many miles and is famous for the wild beauty of its scenery. The hills we have followed so long run through the upper part of the park, and magnificent are the views of the sea and Sussex Downs which meet us at these forest glades, where stately avenues of beech and oak and chestnut throw long shadows over the grass, and antlered deer start up from the bracken at our feet. But the lower slopes are pleasant too, with the venerable yews and thorns and hornbeams dotted over the hillside, and the heights above clad with a wealth of mingled foliage, which is reflected in the bright waters of the still, clear lake. The old ivy-grown church stands close to the water's edge and contains some fine tombs of the Earls of Winchelsea and of their ancestors, the Finches. But the traveller will look with more interest on the sepulchral arch, which is said to cover the ashes of the last of the Plantagenets. The burial registers indeed record that Richard Plantagenet, the illegitimate son of Richard III, died at Eastwell on the 22nd of December, 1550, and a well, which goes by the name of Plantagenet's Well, marks the site of the cottage where he lived in confinement after the defeat of his father on Bosworth Field. Eastwell House, for some years the residence of His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, was originally built by Sir Thomas Moyle, Speaker of the House of Commons in the reign of Henry VIII, but has been completely altered and modernized since it passed into the Winchelsea family. Leaving it on our left, we come out of the park at Boughton Leys, a group of houses on a three-cornered green, and follow in the steps of the old track to Boughton Aloof Church, a large cruciform building with a spacious north aisle and massive central tower, standing in a very lonely situation. Boughton, called Boughton or Baltoon in former times, belonged to Earl Godwin and his son Harold before the Conquest, after which it was given to Eustace, Earl of Boulogne, and formed part of Juliana de Leybourne's vast inheritance. It took the name of Aloof from a Norman knight, Aloofus de Boughton, who held the manor in the reign of King John, and became thus distinguished from the other parishes of Boughton in the neighbourhood. From the church, a grassy lane, shaded by trees, ascends the hill to Challock on the borders of Eastwell Park, and is probably the old track of the Pilgrims Way, which passed between these woods and the park of Godmersham. This was formerly the property of Jane Austen's brother, who took the name of Knight on succeeding to the estate, but it has now passed into the hands of another family. Until the dissolution, the manor and church of Godmersham belonged to Christ Church, and here, in medieval days, the priors of the convent had a fine manor house, where they frequently resided during the summer months. The hall was pulled down in 1810, and nothing of the old house is now left, except a gable and doorway adorned with a figure of a prior wearing his mitre and holding his crozier in his hand, probably intended for Henry d'Estria, the prior who rebuilt the manor house in 1290. The church of Godmersham is remarkable for its early tower and curious semicircular apse with small Norman lights, which are evidently remains of an older building, and in the churchyard are some very ancient yews, one of which is said to have been planted before the Conquest. Under the shadow of these venerable trees there sleeps a remarkable woman, Mary Sibylla Holland, whose father was at one time vicar of Godmersham, and afterwards moved to Harbledown, a larger parish near Canterbury, a few miles further along the Pilgrims Way. Both Mrs. Holland and her distinguished brother, the lamented Sir Alfred Lisle, retained a lifelong affection for this corner of East Kent. When Lisle was far away in India, ruling over millions of British subjects in the northwest provinces, his verses tell us how passionately he yearned for his old Kentish home. Ah, that hamlet in Saxon Kent! Shall I find it when I come home? With toil and travelling well nigh spent, tired with life in jungle and tent, eastward never again to roam. Pleasantest corner the world can show, in a vale which slopes to the English sea, where strawberries wild in the woodland grow, and the cherry tree branches are bending low. No such fruit in the south country. Sir Alfred died on the 10th of April, 1911, at Lord Tennyson's house at Farringford, in the Isle of Wight, and was buried in the churchyard of St. Michael's, Harbledown. Now brother and sister are both sleeping under the grassy sod of the Kentish land which they loved so well, where the nightingales sing heart-piercing notes in the silence of the early summer night. Shelter for me and for you, my friend. There let us settle when both are old, and whenever I come to my journey's end, there you shall see me laid, and blend just one tear with the falling mould. End of chapter 11. Recording by Owlivia.
Chapter 12 of The Pilgrims Way, From Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury by Julia Cartwright. Chapter 12. Chilham to Harbledown. The Pilgrims Way skirted the wooded slopes of Godmersham Park for about a mile and then entered Chilham Park. The park is now closed, but the old track lay right across the park and in front of Chilham Castle. The position of this fortress, overlooking the valley of the Stour, has made it memorable in English history. Chilham has been in turn a Roman camp, a Saxon castle, and a Norman keep, and has played an eventful part in some of the fiercest struggles of those days. According to a generally received tradition recorded by Camden, Chilham was the scene of the battle on the river in Caesar's second expedition, and the British barrow near the Stour, popularly known as Juluba's grave, was believed to be the tomb of the Roman tribune Julius Liberius, although as a matter of fact it contains no sepulchral remains. In the 2nd century, Chilham is said to have been the home of that traditional personage, the Christian king Lucius, and in Saxon days of the chief Silla. The castle was strongly fortified to resist the invasion of the Danes, by whom it was repeatedly attacked. After the Norman conquest, it belonged to Fulbert de Dover, whose last descendant, Isabel, Countess of Athol, died here in 1292, and is buried in the Undercroft at Canterbury. Then it passed into the hands of the great Lord Badlesmere of Leeds, who on one occasion gave Queen Isabel, the wife of Edward II, a splendid reception here, and afterwards astonished the peaceful citizens and monks of Canterbury by appearing at their gates, followed by 19 armed guards, each with a drawn sword in his hand, to pay his devotions at the shrine of St. Thomas. As late as the 16th century, Leland describes Chilham Castle as beautiful for pleasure, commodious for use, and strong for defence. But soon after he wrote these words, the greater part of the old house was pulled down by its owner, Sir Thomas Cheney, warden of the Cinque Ports under Edward VI. To complete his new mansion in the Isle of Sheppey, the Norman keep, an octagonal fortress 3 stories high, is the only part of the medieval structure that now remains, and can still be seen in the gardens of the new house, built in 1616 by Sir Dudley Digges, Master of the Rolls in the reign of James I. This fine Jacobean manor house stands well on the rising ground above the river, and both the garden terrace and the top of the old keep afford beautiful views of the Vale of Ashford and the downs beyond the Wye. Still more picturesque is the marketplace of Chilham itself. On one side we have the red brick walls and white stone doorway of the castle, seen at the end of its short avenue of tall lime trees, on the other the quaint red roofs and timbered houses of the charming old square, with the grey church tower surrounded by the brilliant green of sycamores and beeches. On a bright spring morning, when the leaves are young and the meadows along the riverside are golden with buttercups, there can be no prettier picture than this of the old market square of Silla's home. From the heights of Chilham, the Pilgrims Way descends into the valley of the Stour, and after following the course of the river for a short time, climbs the opposite hill and strikes into Bigbury Wood. Here we come suddenly upon the most ancient earthwork along the whole of the road, an entrenchment which Professor Boyd Dawkins, who explored it thoroughly some years ago, has ascribed to the prehistoric Iron Age. For most of us, perhaps, Bigbury Camp has a still greater interest as the fort which the Britons held against the assault of the Roman invaders, and which was stormed and carried by Caesar's legions. The memory of that desperate fight which sealed the fate of Britain and her conquest by the great proconsul still lingers in the popular mind, and the shepherd who follows his flock and the waggoner who drives his team along the road still talk of the famous battle that was fought here 2,000 years ago. After this, the path crosses the valley and runs through the hop gardens to join Watling Street, the road by which Chaucer's pilgrims came to Canterbury at Harbledown. This is the little village on the edge of the forest of Blean, which has been immortalised by Chaucer's lines: "Wist ye not where standeth the little town, which that clept is Bob up and down, under the Blee in Canterbury Way?" And Bob up and down is, to this day, a true and characteristic description of the rolling ground by which we approach Harbledown. Here the Pilgrim's Road, along which we have journeyed over hill and dale, fails to rise again. We climb the last hill, and on the summit of the rising ground we find ourselves close to the Lazar House, founded at Harbledown by Lanfranc in 1084. The wooden houses built by the Norman Archbishop for the reception of 10 brothers and 7 sisters have been replaced by a row of modern almshouses, but the chapel still preserves its old Norman doorway, and the round arches and pillars of an arcade to the north of the nave, which formed part of the hospital church dedicated by Lanfranc to St. Nicholas. The devout pilgrim to St. Thomas's shrine never failed to visit this ancient leper house. Not only did the antiquity of the charitable foundation and its nearness to the road attract him, but in the common hall of the hospital a precious relic was preserved, in the shape of a crystal which had once adorned the leather of St. Thomas's shoe. Many were the royal personages and distinguished strangers who paused before these old walls and dropped their arms into the poor leper's outstretched hand. Here we read, in contemporary records, Henry II came on his first memorable pilgrimage to the tomb of the martyred archbishop, and Richard Coeur de Lion after his release from his long captivity. Edward I stopped at Harbledown with his brave queen, Eleanor of Castile, on their return from the Holy Land, and the Black Prince, accompanied by his royal captive, King John of France, and that monarch's young son Philip, also visited the leper house. And when the French king visited Canterbury for the second time, on his return to his own kingdom, he did not forget to stop at Lanfranc's old lazar house and leave 10 gold coins pour le nonain de Harbledown. But it is a later and more sceptical traveller, Erasmus, who has left us the most vivid description of Harbledown, and of the feelings which the sight of the relic aroused in the heart of his companion, Dean Colley. Not far from Canterbury, at the left-hand side of the road, he writes, in the record of his pilgrimage, there is a small almshouse for old people, one of whom ran out, seeming to hear the steps of the horses. He first sprinkled us with holy water, and then offered us the upper leather of a shoe bound in a brass rim, with a crystal set in its centre like a jewel. Gratian, Dean Colley, rode on my left, nearer to the beggar-man, and was duly sprinkled, bearing it with a tolerable amount of equanimity. But when the shoe was handed up, he asked the old man what he wanted. "It is the shoe of St. Thomas," was the answer. Upon hearing this, he fired up and turned to me, exclaiming indignantly, "What? Do these cattle mean we should kiss the shoes of every good man?" Erasmus, sorry for the old man's feelings, dropped a small coin into his hand, which made him quite happy, and the 2 pilgrims rode on to London, discussing the question of the worship of relics as they went. To this day, a maple bowl bound with a brass rim containing a piece of crystal is preserved in the hospital at Harbledown. The selfsame relic it may be, which was shown to Erasmus and Colley, and which Lambarde, writing half a century later, describes as fair set in copper and crystal, while an old wooden box with a slit in the lid for money and a chain attached to it is said to be the one into which Erasmus dropped his coin. Behind the ivy-mantled tower of Lanfranc's chapel is a clear spring which was supposed to possess healing virtues, and is still believed by the country folks to be of great benefit to the eyes. This spring still goes by the name of the Black Prince's Well, from an old tradition that the warrior of Crécy and Poitiers drank of its waters when he visited the hospital at Harbledown in 1357. Many, we know, are the memorials of this popular hero at Canterbury. Only 3 days after he landed at Sandwich, he came, accompanied by his royal captive, to return thanks at St. Thomas's shrine for his victories, and 6 years afterwards he founded and decorated the beautiful chantry in the cathedral crypt, which still bears his name, on the occasion of his marriage with his cousin Joan, the Fair Maid of Kent. The old legend of the Black Prince's Well goes on to tell how, when he lay dying of the wasting disease which carried him off in the flower of his life, he thought of the wonder-working spring near Canterbury, and sent to Harbledown for a draught of its pure waters. But even that could not save him, and on the 29th of September, 1376, a stately funeral procession wound its way down the hillside at Harbledown, bearing the Black Prince to the grave which he had chosen for himself, in the chapel of Our Lady of the Undercroft at Canterbury. At Harbledown, the pilgrims caught their first sight of the cathedral. Here they fell on their knees when they saw the golden angel on the top of the central tower, and knew that the goal of their pilgrimage was almost reached. Here Chaucer's goodly company made their last halt, and for the moment the noise of singing and piping and jingling of bells gave place to a graver and more solemn mood, as the motley crowd of pilgrims pressed around, to hear this time not a Canterbury tale, but a sermon. Deep was the impression which that first sight of Canterbury made upon Erasmus. The cold, critical scholar becomes eloquent as he describes the great church of St. Thomas rearing itself up into the sky with a majesty that strikes awe into every heart, and the clanging of bells which, thrilling through the air, salute the pilgrims from afar. Today the great cross is gone from the west gate. The shining archangel no longer blesses the kneeling pilgrim from the topmost steeple, but the same glorious vision of the great cathedral, rising with all its towers into the sky, meets the eyes of the traveller who looks down on Canterbury from the hill of Harbledown. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Pilgrims Way, from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pilgrims Way, from Winchester to Canterbury, by Julia Cartwright. Chapter 13, Harbledown to Canterbury. From Harbledown it is all downhill to Canterbury, and a short mile brings us to the massive round tower of Simon of Sudbury's noble Westgate, the only one remaining of the 7 fortified gateways which once guarded the ancient city. Many are the pilgrims who have entered Canterbury by this gate, kings and queens of all ages, foreign emperors and princes, armed knights and humble scholars, good Queen Philippa and Edward Plantagenet, Henry of Agincourt, Margaret of Anjou, Chaucer and Erasmus. Many too are the long processions which have wound down this hillside, newly created archbishops followed by a brilliant train of bishops and courtiers on their way to be enthroned in the chair of St. Augustine. Solemn funerals, attended with all the pomp and circumstance, the funeral plumes and sable trappings with which men honour the mighty dead. Through the west gate went forth that gay company of monks and friars, of merchants and citizens crowned with garlands of flowers, and making joyous minstrelsy as they rode out to welcome Archbishop Winchelsea, who, once a poor student in the school at Canterbury, now came to be enthroned in state in the presence of King Edward I and all his court. And this way too they bore him with much state and pomp, 18 years later, from the manor house at Otford, where he died, to sleep in his own cathedral after all the labours and struggles, the storms and changes of his troublous reign. Since these medieval days, Canterbury has seen many changes. The splendours of which Camden and Leland wrote have passed away. The countless number of its churches has been reduced, and their magnificence no longer strikes the eye of the stranger. The lofty walls and their 21 watchtowers which encircled the city in a complete ring when Chaucer's knight, after paying his devotion at the shrine of St. Thomas, went out to see their strength, and pointed to his son both the peril and the doubt, are all gone, and the Conqueror's mighty castle is turned into a coal pit. But the old city is still full of quaint corners and picturesque buildings, timbered houses with carved corbels and oriel windows, hostelries with overhanging eaves and fantastic signboards of wrought ironwork, hospitals whose charters date from Norman times, and whose records give us many a curious peep into the byways of medieval life. As we draw near the Martyr's shrine, memories of St. Thomas crowd upon us. The hill outside the West Gate, now occupied by the Clergy Orphan School, is still called St. Thomas's Hill, and was formerly the site of a chapel founded by Becket himself. A little way up the High Street we reach a bridge over the Stour, which winds its way through the heart of the city, and a low pointed doorway on our right leads into St. Thomas's Hospital. This ancient spittle of East Bridge was founded, as a 14th century charter records, by the glorious St. Thomas the Martyr to receive poor wayfaring men. Archbishop Hubert Walter increased its endowments in the 12th century, and Stratford repaired the walls in the 14th and drew up statutes for its government. From that time it was especially devoted to the use of poor pilgrims, for whom 12 beds were provided and whose wants were supplied at the rate of 4d. a day. During those days, when the enthusiasm for St. Thomas was at its height, alms and legacies were lavished upon Eastbridge Hospital, and Edward III bequeathed money to support a chaplain whose duty it was to say daily masses for the founders of the hospital. After the days of pilgrimages were over, this hospital was applied to various uses until Archbishop Whitgift recovered the property and drew up fresh statutes for its management. 10 poor brothers and sisters still enjoy the fruit of St. Thomas's benevolence, and dwell in the old house built on arches across the bed of the river. The low level of the floor, which has sunk far below that of the street, and the vaulted roof and time-worn pillars bear witness to its great antiquity. There can be little doubt that the round arches of the Norman crypt belonged to St. Thomas's original foundation, while the pointed windows of the chapel and early English arches of the refectory form part of Archbishop Stratford's improvements. In this hall, some portions of frescoes, representing on the one hand the Last Supper, on the other the martyrdom of the saint, the penance of Henry II at his tomb, with the central figure of Christ in glory, have been lately recovered from under the coat of whitewash which had concealed them for more than 2 centuries. Twice a year, we know, at the summer festival of the Translation of St. Thomas on the 7th of July, and at the winter festival of the Martyrdom on the 29th of December, Canterbury was crowded with pilgrims, and a notice was placed in the High Street ordering the due provision of beds and entertainment for strangers. The concourse was still greater on the Jubilees of the Translation, when indulgences were showered freely on all who visited the shrine, and the festival lasted for a whole fortnight. At the Jubilee of the year 1420, just after the victory of Agincourt, no less than 100,000 pilgrims are said to have been present. On such occasions every available corner was occupied. The inns, which were exceedingly numerous, the hospitals, and, above all, the religious houses, were thronged with strangers. The most favourite, the most renowned of all the hostelries was the Chequers of the Hope, the inn where Chaucer's 29 pilgrims took up their quarters, at chequers of the hope that every man doth know. This ancient inn, which Prior Chilham rebuilt about 1400, stood at the corner of High Street and Mercery Lane, the old Merceria, which was formerly lined with rows of booths and stalls for the sale of pilgrimage tokens, such as are to be found in the neighbourhood of all famous shrines. Both ampullas, small leaden bottles containing a drop of the martyr's blood which flowed perennially from a well in the precincts, and caput tomi, or brooches bearing the saint's mitred head, were eagerly sought after by all Canterbury pilgrims. So too were the small metal bells, which are said to have given their name to the favourite Kentish flower, the Canterbury bell. And we read that the French King John stopped at the mercery stalls to buy a knife for the Count of Auxerre. The position of the inn, close to the great gate of Christ Church, naturally attracted many visitors, and the spacious cellars with vaulted roofs, which once belonged to the inn, may still be seen, although the inner courtyard and the great chamber upstairs, occupied by the pilgrims and known as the dormitory of 100 beds, were burnt down 40 years ago. But the old street front, with its broad eaves overhanging the narrow lane leading up to the great gateway at the other end, still remains, and renders Mercery Lane the most picturesque and interesting corner of the cathedral city. The religious houses were open to all comers, and while royal visitors were lodged in St Augustine's Abbey, the convents of the mendicant orders were largely frequented by the poorer classes. There was also the house of the Whitefriars or Augustinians in the eastern part of the town, close to St George's Gate, and the Hospital of St John in the populous North Gate, that fair and large house of stone, built and endowed by Lanfranc in the 11th century, besides that of the East Bridge, which has already been mentioned, and many other smaller foundations. But it was in the great priory of Christ Church that by far the largest number of pilgrims found hospitable welcome. A considerable part of the convent buildings was set aside for their reception. The prior himself entertained distinguished strangers and lodged them in the splendid suite of rooms overlooking the convent garden, known as the Omers or Homers, les Ormeaux, from a neighbouring grove of elms. This range of buildings, including the banqueting hall, generally known as Meister Omers, was broken up into prebendal houses after the dissolution, and supplied 3 separate residences for members of the new chapter, which gives us some idea of the size of these lodgings. For ordinary strangers there was the guest hall, near the kitchen, on the west side of the prior's court, which was under the especial charge of a cellarer appointed to provide for the needs of the guests. Prior Chilham, whom Leland describes as the greatest builder of a prior that ever was in Christ Church, repaired and enlarged this stranger's hall early in the 15th century, and added a new chamber for hospitality, which bore the name of Chilham's guest chamber, and now forms part of the Bishop of Dover's house. Finally, without the convent precincts, close to the court gateway, where the beautiful Norman stairway leads up to the great hall, or aula nova, was the almonry. Here the statutes of Archbishop Winchelsea, he who had known what it was to hunger and thirst in his boyhood, and who remained all through his greatness the friend of the poor, provided that poor pilgrims and beggars should be fed daily with the fragments of bread and meat, which were many and great, left on the monks' tables, and brought here by the wooden pentice or covered passage leading from the kitchen. This almonry became richly endowed by wealthy pilgrims in course of years, and early in the 14th century Prior Henry of Estria built a chapel close by, which was dedicated to St Thomas the Martyr, and much frequented by pilgrims. The almonry was turned into a mint yard at the dissolution, and the chapel and priest lodgings attached to it now belong to the King's School. Another privilege freely conceded by the prior and monks of this great community to pilgrims of all ranks and nationality who might die at Canterbury was that of burial within the precincts of Christ Church, close to the Blessed Martyr's shrine, and under the shadow of the cathedral walls. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury by Julia Cartwright. Chapter 14. The Martyr's Shrine. Erasmus has described the imposing effect of the great cathedral church on the stranger who entered its doors for the first time and saw the nave in all its spacious majesty. The vision which broke upon the eyes of those pilgrims who, like himself and Dean Colet, visited Canterbury in the early years of the 16th century, may well have filled all hearts with wonder. for then the work was well nigh perfected. The long roll of master builders from Prior Wiebout and de Estria to Chilham and Selling had faithfully accomplished their task. Prior Goldstone, the last but one who reigned before the dissolution, had just completed the central tower, the great labour of his predecessor Prior Selling's life, and was in the act of building the noble perpendicular gateway which forms a fitting entrance to the precincts. And now the great church stood complete. Without, a very goodly, strong, and beautiful structure. The traceries and mouldings of the windows, the stone canopies and sculptured images of the portal, all perfect. The glorious towers in their might, Bell Harry steeple as we see it today, matchless in its strength and beauty, and beside it, rivalling its grace and majesty, the ancient Norman tower, which bore the name of Ethelbert, crowned with the Arundel spire. Within, a richness and splendour to which our eyes are wholly unaccustomed, chapels and chantries lining the great nave, fresh from Prior Chillenden's work. Altars glittering with lighted tapers and gold and silver ornaments, roof and walls bright with painting and gilding or decked with silken tapestry hangings, carved images covered with pearls and gems, stained windows throwing their hues of ruby and sapphire across the floor and lighting up the clouds of incense as they rose heavenward. All this and much more met the pilgrims' wondering eyes. No wonder they stood half amazed, as the supplementary tale to Chaucer's pilgrimage describes the gardener and the miller and the other lewd sets, gazing up at the painted windows and forgetting to move on with the crowd. Then the show began. First of all, the pilgrims were led up a vaulted passage and many steps to the transept of the martyrdom, where the wooden altar, at the foot of which the saint fell, remained to show the actual place of the murder, and its guardian priest, the custos martyrum, displayed the rusty sword of Richard le Breton. Next, descending the flight of steps on the right, they were led into the dark crypt, where more priests received them, and presented the saint's skull encased in silver to be kissed, and other relics, including the famous girdle and hair shirt. This caput Tomai was one of the chief stations at which offerings were made, and the altar on which it lay, mentioned in the Black Prince's will as the altar where the head is, marked the site of the original grave where the saint was buried by the frightened monks on the day after the murder. The tomb stood in the eastern chapel of Ernulf's crypt, under the beautiful pointed arches afterwards raised by that great architect William the Englishman, whom Gervase describes as small in body, but in workmanship skilled and honest. Soon it acquired a miraculous virtue, and the fame of the cures and wonders wrought there rang throughout the world. It was the scene of Henry II's penance, and during the next 50 years it remained the central object of interest to the crowds of pilgrims who came from all parts of Christendom. Coeur de Lion, accompanied by William, King of Scotland, knelt here on his way to the Crusades to implore the martyr's blessing on his arms. Many were the crusaders from all parts of France and England who came thither on the same errand. King John and his wife Isabella, who were crowned at Canterbury Cathedral by Archbishop Hubert Walter at Easter 1201, offered their coronation canopies at this tomb, and vast sums of money were yearly offered here until 1220, when the body of St. Thomas was translated in the presence of the young King Henry III to the new shrine at Trinity Chapel, immediately above the tomb in the crypt. In that year, the offerings at the tomb, at the altar of the Sword's Point, and at the new shrine reached the enormous amount of £1,071, a sum equal to more than £20,000 of money at the present time. After this, the offerings at the original tomb in the crypt diminished in number and value, but the altar and relics of the Caput Tomai remained an object of deep reverence until the Reformation. From the dark vaults of the subterranean church, the pilgrims were led up the steps to the north aisle of the choir. Here the great mass of relics, including St. George's arm and no less than 400 skulls, jaws, teeth, hands, and other bones, were displayed in gold, silver, or ivory caskets, and pilgrims were allowed a glimpse of the magnificent vessels and ornaments stored up under the high altar. "All the gold of Midas and Croesus," exclaims Erasmus, "would have been nothing by the side of these treasures," and he confesses that he sighed to think he kept no such relics at home, and had to beg the saint's pardon for this very unholy emotion. The golden candlesticks and silken vestments of the sacristy in St. Andrew's Tower, and the saint's pallium, which no ordinary pilgrims might see, were also shown to Erasmus and Colet, who brought with them a letter of introduction from Archbishop Wareham. After duly inspecting these precious objects, they mounted the long flight of steps behind the high altar leading into Trinity Chapel, a continual ascent, church, as it were, piled upon church, which seems to have greatly heightened the impression produced upon the awe-struck pilgrims. Now, at last, they stood within the holiest of holies. There, before their eyes, was the goal of all their journeyings, the object of their deepest devotion, the shrine which held the body of the blessed martyr. The shrine itself, covered by a painted canopy of wood, rested on stone arches in the centre of the floor, exactly under the gilded crescent which is still to be seen in the cathedral roof. On the right was the richly carved and canopied monument of Henry IV and his queen, Joan of Navarre, with its elaborate effigies of the royal pair wearing their crowns and robes of state. On the left, the tomb of Edward, the Black Prince. He had willed to sleep before the altar of Our Lady of the Undercroft, in the chapel adorned by his own gifts, but the people who had loved him so well would not allow their hero to remain buried out of sight in the dark crypt. So they brought him to rest by the great saint's shrine, where all men could see his effigy of gilded bronze as he lay there, clad in armour, his sword by his side, his hands clasped in prayer, and read the pathetic lines which tell of his departed glories and bid the passing stranger pray for his soul. Pour Dieu, priez au célestin roi, que merci est de l'âme de moi. His was the first tomb that was ever raised in the sacred precincts devoted to the martyr's shrine, and to this day it remains there, unhurt by the hand of time or the more cruel violence of man. Up the worn stone steps, which still bear the marks left by thousands of feet and knees, the pilgrims climbed, murmuring words of prayer or chanting the popular Latin hymns to St. Thomas. Tu per Thomae sanguinem quem pro te impendit, fac nos Christe scandere quo Thomas ascendit. Here the prior himself received them, and showed them first the corona, or crown, of Becket's head, preserved in a golden likeness of St. Thomas's face, ornamented with pearls and precious gems, which had been presented by Henry V. Then, at a given sign, the wooden canopy was drawn up by ropes, and the shrine itself, embossed with gold and glittering with countless jewels that flashed and sparkled with light, was revealed to the eyes of the pilgrims. they all fell upon their knees and worshipped, while the prior with his white wand pointed out the ballast rubies and diamonds, the sapphires and emeralds which adorned the shrine, and told the names of the royal persons by whom these gifts had been presented. There were rings and brooches and chains without end, golden and silver statues offered by kings and queens, the crown of Scotland brought back by Edward I after his victory over John Balliol, and the Reigate of France, that superb ruby presented at the tomb in the crypt by Louis VII, which shone like fire and was as costly as a king's ransom. Full of awe and wonder, the spectators gazed with admiring eyes on these treasures, which for beauty and splendour were beyond all they had ever dreamt, until the canopy slowly descended, and the shrine was once more hidden from their sight. Full of awe and wonder, the spectators gazed with admiring eyes on these treasures, which for beauty and splendour were beyond all they had ever dreamt, until the canopy slowly descended, and the shrine was once more hidden from their sight. Then they went their way, some to visit the convent buildings, the noble chapter house with its gabled roof and stained windows, and the glazed walk of the cloisters, glowing with bright colours and decorated with heraldic devices of benefactors to Christ Church painted on the bosses of the vaulting. Others made themselves fresh and gay, and went out to see the city, the knight and his son to look at the walls, the prioress and the wife of Bath to walk in the herbery of the inn. But for Erasmus and his rather inconvenient companion, there was still a sight in store, only reserved for very exalted personages, or such as had friends at court. Prior Goldstone, a gentle and well-bred man, not altogether ignorant, as Erasmus found, of the Scotian theology, himself took them back into the crypt, and lanterns were brought to illumine the dark vaults. By their light the prior led the way into the church of Our Lady of the Undercroft, which was divided from the rest of the crypt by strong iron railings. Here the two friends saw what Erasmus might well call a display of more than royal splendour. For here, surrounded by exquisitely carved stonework screens and a beautiful reredos with delicate traceries and mouldings, richly coloured and gilt, was the altar of Our Lady, adorned with precious ornaments and twinkling with hundreds of silver lamps. There, in the central niche, under a crocketed and pinnacled canopy, stood the famous silver image of the Blessed Virgin herself. And there was the jewelled tabernacle and frontal, with its picture of the Assumption worked in gold, and the chalice and cruets in the form of angels, and the great silver candelabra with which the Black Prince had enriched his favourite shrine. There, too, were the costly gifts and jewels presented by his son, Richard II, the gold brooches offered yearly by Edward I, the white silk vestments, diapered with a vine pattern of blue, bequeathed by the Black Prince, and countless other rare and precious things, which filled Erasmus with envy and wonder. But then, as ill luck would have it, the prior conducted his guests into the sacristy, where on bended knees he opened a black leathern chest, out of which he produced a parcel of ragged handkerchiefs, with which St. Thomas used to wipe his face. This was too much for Dean Collett's patience, already sorely tried as it had been by what he had seen and heard. When the gentle prior offered him one of the filthy rags as a present, he shrank back in evident disgust, and turned up his nose with an expression of contempt, which filled Erasmus with shame and terror. Fortunately, the prior was a man of sense and courtesy, so he appeared to take no notice, and after giving his guests a cup of wine, politely bade them farewell. Before this, Collett had alarmed his more timid friend by the bold way in which he had dared to question the priest who guarded the gilded head. He had even gone so far as to remark aloud that the saint who was so charitable in his lifetime would surely be better pleased if some trifling part of these riches were spent in relieving the poor and destitute. Upon which the monk had glared at him with gorgon eyes, and Erasmus felt sure would have turned them out of the church forthwith had it not been for Archbishop Wareham's letter. But in these words of the honest Dean we see a foreboding of the new and critical spirit that was fast undermining the old beliefs. Already the days of pilgrimages were numbered, and the glories of St. Thomas were on the wane. A few more years, and the monks who guarded his treasures were rudely disturbed. The glorious shrine was stripped of its priceless gems. The wrought gold and precious jewels were borne away in 2 enormous chests, such as 6 or 7 men could barely lift. The wonderful ruby, which flashed fire in the darkness, was set in a ring and worn by King Harry himself on his thumb. Finally, to complete the sacrilege, the relics of the saint were publicly burnt, and his ashes scattered to the winds. Only the broken pavement and the marks of the pilgrims' knees in the stone floor were left to show future generations this spot, hallowed by the prayers and the worship of past ages. End of chapter 14. End of The Pilgrims Way from Winchester to Canterbury by Julia Cartwright.